Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
The pre-dawn light played with the young emerald green of the forest that spread out on both sides of the track. The good road surface clung perfectly to the tires. The car flew along the deserted road at this hour without obstacles. She would arrive home even faster than expected. Beatrice was completely satisfied with life. The day had ended marvelously. She had concluded a profitable contract. She had managed even faster and better than she had expected. And now she was going home, humming a little tune to herself. She had a substantial amount of money with her in a suitcase. One might well say that it was madness to carry such sums around unguarded. But Beatrice didn't think so. Firstly, no one knew that she would be traveling with that kind of money. And secondly, she wasn't on a bus, she was in a car. So who could get the money out of her? She didn't know whether she was going on this business trip or not, whether she was going to come back with a win or a loss. And that's how good it turned out. How could she not sing? Suddenly her car stumbled on the smooth road. She pulled to the side of the road, slowed down. A punctured tire, apparently. There's no way everything's going to be fine. Something is bound to ruin the holiday, she thought. She got out of the car, walked around it, and saw that the matter was much more serious. Both front wheels were punctured. But why? How could this happen? She walked around the car and noticed that the puncture was no accident. There were some thorns lying on the road, which she had run over. Beatrice barely had time to pull out her phone before 3 men came out of the woods, and it was obvious from their faces that they weren't going to help at all. They probably had very different goals in mind. "Good afternoon, madam," one said with a mocking tone. "Would you like to help? We are not mechanics, but to relieve you of some extra weight is quite—" "Stop talking," interrupted the other older bandit, and turned to Beatrice. "Give me the phone. Then you'll be making small talk." She realized that she could not get rid of these scoundrels, and she was glad to lose some of her possessions, but to keep the main thing, and her life, of course. And so, wishing to calm them down, she gave the phone without talking and added, "I have everything I have in my purse there in the salon," and turned to go to the car, but her way was blocked. "We'll take the purse, don't worry," said the ringleader, apparently, "but the main thing is that suitcase." "No, that's not mine," exclaimed Beatrice in despair, realizing that she was about to lose everything. "It's clear it's not yours," the gray man grinned, and a blow fell on Beatrice's head. The world plunged into darkness. She woke up in the twilight and did not immediately remember what had happened. One thing she realized at once: she was in the forest, sitting with her back to a tree, and she couldn't move because she was tied up. That is, she was in a completely helpless position, unable to move her arms or legs. She had obviously been dragged far from the road because there was no clearance between the trees, and there's hardly any human traffic, so she had a good chance of dying right here from hunger, cold, thirst. The mosquitoes had already gathered for a feast. Screaming is probably useless, but what to do? And at the same time, she sensed that she was not alone here. Someone was nearby, and that someone was hardly in a kindly mood towards her. Beatrice heard a low but threatening growl, and clearly not just one living creature, for the growl seemed to come from all directions at once. "My God," she whispered in a pitifully trembling voice. How on earth could this have happened to her? After all, not long ago she had been perfectly happy and content with her life, and now she seemed to be devoured by some beasts. She looked into the bushes growing around her and saw some terrible lights. They were the eyes of wolves, and there were at least 3 of them. What wolves do in the forest with people is unknown. So she, a recently successful businesswoman, would become just fodder for wild animals. Well, maybe it's better this way. She won't have to die a long and painful death tied to a tree. This hopelessness made her head swim. Beatrice felt like she was about to pass out. I hope they don't eat people who are already dead. Besides, they don't seem to be showing any aggression. Maybe these wolves have already eaten something else. A hare, squirrels. I don't know. Some sheep stolen. What the hell is going on in my head? She thought, and suddenly she heard a human voice. The strangest thing was that it was clearly not the voice of an adult, but of a child. Akila, Alba, what did you find there? Come here, the boy clearly called out to the wolves. Or was it dogs after all? Beatrice turned her head, as far as she could, at the sound of footsteps and saw what appeared from behind the bushes was indeed a child. A boy of about 8, small but dressed like a real hunter, in a camouflage-colored uniform. But she apparently mistook the dogs for wolves, and the boy with his parents came, probably, to hunt. So there was hope of rescue. Hey boy, she called out to him. Help me, please. Where are your parents? Oh, said the boy. Who tied you up? Are you bandits or something? I'll untie you now. He pulled a knife from his belt and cut the ropes that tied her to the tree. Beatrice breathed a sigh of relief and fell onto her side, kneading her stiff arms. Yes, bandits, she whispered in a great voice. I need to get out of here as soon as possible. Get to town. Are those your dogs? Are you here with your parents? They're wolves, not dogs. But you don't have to be afraid. They're tame. I'm here alone, and my dad is out there in the woods, in a hut. He used to be a gamekeeper and stayed here. It's a long way to town, and it'll be night soon. Let me take you back to our place. You won't get anywhere now anyway. Beatrice realized that she would not really get anywhere in her condition. Her head ached, her arms, legs, and back were stiff. She carefully stood up and obediently said, All right, take me to your hut. But how do you live here in the forest? Very simply, replied the lad with conviction. It's not so bad here. It's even good, to be honest. We're used to it. I hope your animals won't bite me, asked Beatrice, glancing apprehensively at the wolves, who seemed to be driving her from behind. No, they are not predatory. We have been raising them since they were babies. We rescued them from poachers a year ago. My dad knows exactly how to handle them. That's good, of course. But who's been raising you since you were a baby? Don't you live here all the time? You have to go to school, Beatrice said, realizing that something had to be said, but not knowing what to talk about with this little boy. It was strange, very strange, and there was no telling where this boy would take her or what kind of a daddy lived in a hut. Yeah, well, I'm not going to school yet. I'll be sure to go sometime later. I guess I can read and write and count pretty well even now. My dad teaches me. The two of us live here, we like it, and I don't want to go to the city. How much further is it? I feel dizzy. I don't feel very well. I'd like to sit down and have a drink of water. Those scoundrels must have given me a good bashing on the head. Yes, we'll be there soon. Don't worry. The kid walked ahead on the trail, stepping on his sturdy booted feet. Daddy will get you drunk and fed at home. Don't worry, it's great here. You'll see, you'll love it. Yes, I can imagine, Beatrice thought without much hope. I bet he's either a sectarian or some nutcase living in the woods. He's dragging the child with him. I only hope he won't do anything bad to me, at least not in front of his son. But who knows? Looks like I'm in big trouble, Beatrice thought. And yet she asked, How far is it to town? I know it's nice here, but I can't live in the woods forever. I have a job there, and people will be looking for me. It's not very far. I'll walk you to the road tomorrow, and there I don't know if you'll catch a hitchhiker. We don't have a car, explained the boy. What will they look for? They won't find us here either, I think. Nobody knows about us. Dad doesn't want strangers to come to our house. Well, congratulations. I'm really going to visit a lonely lunatic, thought Beatrice, with a sort of cheerful annoyance. I hope he won't kill me, lest I should tell the town about his lair. It's a pity about the boy. Well, let's see who the gamekeeper is. They walked, contrary to the boy's promise, for quite a long time, though maybe it wasn't far on his legs. Beatrice, who was used to the asphalt, could hardly move her feet, stumbling over some holes and clinging to branches. But still the hut came into view, a good-sized hut, not a bad one, and evidently sturdy. Well, here's our house, said the lad, making a hospitable sign with his hand. "Come on in, we'll get acquainted." This very dad turned out to be a grim-looking man traveling around the house in a wheelchair. The wheelchair had clearly been modified for the terrain it would be traveling on. The tires were big, wide. The owner said hello in a surly manner. Beatrice did not immediately realize that it was not because he was unhappy with the arrival of guests, but simply embarrassed by his position. "This ant I rescued in the forest," the son began to explain. "The bandits had stunned her, tied her to a tree, and I cut the ropes and brought her back because it was long and late to go to town. She has a headache and is thirsty." "Well, that's right. Good for you for saving her." The man looked at Beatrice and continued. "Have a seat at the table. There will be tea now. What kind of bandits attacked you? Do you know them?" "No," she answered, "but they must have known somehow that I was going there. I had quite a bit of money on me. They took my phone too, my documents, I guess. Then they hit me on the head and dragged me into the woods. They tied me to a tree there. I guess they hoped I'd die somehow. They weren't what you'd call merciful. Here's some tea. There were some headache pills somewhere. But my advice is that it's better to make do with tea. It's good for you, with herbs." In addition to the tea, he put on the table some simple, but apparently nourishing food, invited his son, and told him to eat. The boy greedily gorged himself on the food, and Beatrice apologetically declined. Somehow she did not feel hungry at all. It was probably the shock of what had happened. "I didn't even ask my savior's name." "I'm Beatrice," she said to the boy. "And I'm Alex." "Nice to meet you, Alex." Beatrice shifted her gaze to the man, waiting for him to introduce himself. "And I'm David," he said. Alex finished his dinner and finished his tea, but it was obvious he didn't feel like leaving the table from the general conversation. He probably didn't see many strangers, much less women, but it was also impossible not to notice that his eyes were already closing. Apparently tired of wandering through the forest, and his nose was already ready to peck the table. "Okay, forest lifeguard, if you fall asleep at the table, there will be no one to carry you to bed," said the father. And Beatrice marveled at the change in his face at the sight of his son. He no longer looked stern or grim. It was evident that David loved Alex, and the boy seemed to know that, and loved his father too. So he didn't argue, got up, said goodnight to everyone, and left behind the partition. "You, too, as I understand, do not mind sleeping. I'll set you up somewhere in here now. Don't you bother. Well, tomorrow my son will walk you to the railway station. It's really not very close. You could get lost." Is he really wandering in the woods alone? It must be dangerous. Beatrice was really worried about this question. With a guard like that. Our wolves have seen our wolves, I suppose. Especially for me to accompany him, as you understand, is difficult. I mean, I can ride, but you see, not at such a speed, and he's used to it. We have lived here a long time. But how is it possible? After all, it is impossible for a child to live in the woods all the time. Or are you here only for the summer? Yes, no, not only. We've been living like this for 5 years now, and before that we often came here. I don't think that I'm not a hermit. I understand perfectly well that a child needs to live among people. I used to be a gamekeeper. But then I met with poachers, shot in the back, and there, he patted the wheel of his chair with the palm of his hand. Since then, it's been hard for me to go to town for some reason, and sending him there isn't the best option either. I mean, we don't have anyone else, so basically, if there's only one, it's to the orphanage. And what is it like for a child, who is used to such a life, to find himself in this very orphanage, especially since I won't be able to visit him? So you can consider me selfish or whatever you want, but I don't know what will happen to us next. And the boy's mother? Beatrice asked cautiously. The mother, you say? My wife ran away from us before I was even injured. I mean, we didn't exactly live peacefully from the beginning. We only got married because Alex was due. And when he was 3, she ran off with her lover. We haven't heard from her since. I think if she knew what had happened to you, she would have come, well, at least for her son's sake, said Beatrice thoughtfully, who really did not understand this woman's behavior. She had no children, but she could not imagine how one could abandon one's own child. and under such strange circumstances. Here I don't think so, said the host thoughtfully. What's more, I'm sure she wouldn't have come back. That's not why she ran away. I honestly don't want her to come back, because she certainly won't come back to me. And if she takes my son, he'll end up in an orphanage anyway. I don't know how you'll find this strange or what, but she really was very indifferent to the child. You'll forgive me for prying. I just felt sorry for the boy. It's no good for him to live in the woods all his life, for he won't spend it that way. Though I realize he may be well off now, but you understand too. Yes, I understand. In the morning, Beatrice herself was surprised at her condition. She felt perfectly healthy. No pain in her legs or head, and her mood was good. Her host treated her to breakfast, fed her son, and gave her some money so that she could buy a ticket to town. Better go to the station, or you won't know who you'll catch on the motorway, lest something worse happen than it did. And the train is much quicker to get to town and safer. Thank you so much, Beatrice thanked her sincerely. You have a really lovely place here. May I come and visit you again sometime? After all, I owe you now, and I need to thank you for the way you treated me, and for Alex rescuing me. Of course you can come over. I can't say I'm always happy to have guests, but I won't refuse you. And don't consider yourself indebted. We helped you from the bottom of our hearts, the host said, and said goodbye warmly. Beatrice and Alex walked towards the railway station. Alex explained that it was a little longer than to the track, but it would really be more reliable. So they set off as usual, accompanied by the wolves. And if people see you with such unusual pets, won't they be scared? And won't they think it's strange? I don't think your daddy wants your being in the woods to be revealed at all, Beatrice asked. It would seem so, replied the boy. But I'm not going to the station, either. I'll just see you off. That's all, and then you're on your own. But don't you worry, I'll see that you get there, and I hope nobody attacks you. I leave the wolves out of the way so no one will notice. Besides, wolves are smart. They don't go near people. And people, if they see them from afar, they'll think they're dogs. They do look alike. And I also don't want to be noticed because of them, and I don't want to move to the city because of them. Because in the city, with wolves you can't live with them. It's not like I'm giving them to a zoo. Yes, I don't like zoos myself. But now they say there are some non-contact zoos or something like that, where the animals are not in cages, but walk around the territory. Well, almost as if they were free. Exactly, almost. My wolves are used to being out in the open. Besides, I don't know which are non-contact and which are zoos, and they won't let me live in a zoo. That's why I don't want to go to the city. You said it yourself. The woods are great. And why shouldn't I live here forever? The boy apparently sincerely did not understand why he had to leave the forest. Beatrice felt, though, that he wanted to know another life. That was what she spoke of. Well, wouldn't you like to be friends with other kids, play with them, go to school, and just to live in a real flat with a bathtub, electricity? You can play on the computer, watch TV. Have you ever watched a film or cartoons at all? Well, of course I used to, back when we had a flat. And then we also used to go to Uncle Michael sometimes, the one who brings us groceries. He lives in the city, but he goes to the woods a lot, because he says he can't go without the woods. I can't either, nor could any man if he lived a little as we have. Beatrice still caught the doubt in his voice, but realized that the boy was still very much accustomed to the life he had lived, and had not known or seen the other life from afar. I understand that you are used to living like this, but don't be in a hurry to give up the other life. I'm not giving up. And it's not even really about the wolves. It's just that Dad and I live in the woods. I can't leave him, and he doesn't want to go to the city. And he says we don't have a flat there now, so there's no place to live. And besides, he won't be able to get a job because, well, you saw. Beatrice sensed that this conversation was weighing on Alex. Even though he was still young, he must have thought about all this more than once, so it was better not to upset him unnecessarily. She decided to do otherwise, to settle her affairs and come to visit this strange couple one day, to talk to the boy's father about how they should live further, and then, through her own channels, to try to fix their lives. After all, The man suffered through no fault of his own. He can get disability, pension, alimony from his ex-wife and thus live with his son, even in a rented flat. They walked for quite a long time, but the time passed quickly, and soon the noise of electric trains could be heard from behind the trees. "Well, here we are," Alex said. "I won't go any further, or the wolves will lose me and look for me. And there are people there. You only have to cross this field and there will be a station. Well, have a happy journey." "Thank you, Alex." Beatrice hugged him, kissed his cheek, and from his reaction she realized how much this very young boy missed his mother. Poor baby. His father is disabled, and probably not just because of his legs, and his head is messed up and his mother ran away. There are few mothers like that to nail, thought Beatrice, tears welling up in her eyes. "Did you remember the way?" Alex asked in a fallen voice. "You promised to come. Will you come?" "Of course I'll come." "But the road?" "Yes. I didn't really remember it. I don't navigate well in the woods." "Well, I'll just get out at this station and go that way. And if I get lost, you or your wolves will meet me, right? But I probably won't be back for a while. I've got a lot of problems too. Maybe in a week or later?" "Yes, that's a good idea that we'll meet you. The main thing is that you come, and we'll be waiting for you." They said goodbye. Beatrice walked towards the station, and when she turned round, the little figure was gone. She could not get her mind off the thought of that boy, of his father. Only as she entered the small station building did she remember that she had her own problems to deal with. Of course, those who had robbed her would be sought after, but first and foremost she herself wanted to figure out who had found out she was traveling with the money. Was there really a leak of information from some colleague or companion? Only a limited number of people knew about it, thought Beatrice. But it turned out that it didn't make the search that much easier. Anyone could be suspected. The small waiting room contained everything: the timetable, the ticket office, and the duty desk, where a woman sat in front of a working television, concentrating on eating seeds. Suddenly she was distracted from her occupation and shouted to one of the clerks. "Oh, Rachel, look. Our region's on the news. There's another accident on the motorway." "Did a car burn down?" the woman asked. "Hush, hush, they're talking now," and she turned up the sound. Beatrice came closer too, for she was interested. "The car is burned out completely, but we were able to work out the identity of the owner from the plates. It's Beatrice Smith, a businesswoman. Her husband has identified some metal parts of his wife's clothing and jewelry," the announcer reported. Next, John himself, her husband, appeared on the screen. In a breaking voice, he said, "I don't believe it was an accidental fire. She may have been carrying a large sum of money. I believe my wife is alive. After all, no body has been found and the jewelry could have been planted. The investigation is looking into the case. The police believe that the woman is not dead, and they have quite a few questions for her. The missing amount did not belong to her alone," the newscaster said in a stern voice. Next came some other news, and Beatrice stood like a dumbfounded woman. "Of course I'm alive, and all my jewelry is still there. I wasn't wearing much of it. A wedding ring, a chain, and a cross. It's all there. I don't know who ID'd what. And the car couldn't have caught fire on its own. It was clearly set on fire. What questions do they have for me? I have a lot of questions myself," she thought. But the only way to get answers was to go home. She bought a ticket, waited for the train, and went. And at home there was a closed door, and even a gate waiting for her. She couldn't get into her own house, even though she had the keys. Clearly, no one had guessed to take them out of her jeans pocket. Only it was no use, they didn't fit. The lock's been changed. Why? Beatrice thought. She'd only been away for 3 days. When she left, the lock had been in perfect order, and now she stood at the gate of her house like a stranger. She couldn't get in, and she couldn't call her husband to ask him what was going on, because the phone had been taken, and when he will come home, it is unknown. Whenever, but she couldn't stay at the door. She decided to go to his office. No car, no taxi fare, so she decided to go and pay on the spot. If John wasn't there, she could borrow money from someone she knew. I didn't get there in time. I saw my husband not far from the office, near some shop, and not alone. He was hugging some girl. "Stop." Beatrice grabbed the chauffeur by the shoulder. He, probably frightened by her hysterical jerk, braked sharply. She was ashamed of herself, but everything seemed justified. Try to live through so many wild events in a few days. And for dessert, to see her husband in the arms of some, she jumped out of the car, ran up to John and slapped him without further explanation. "Aren't you burying me a little early, bastard?" "Beatrice, what are you doing?" "Beatrice," babbled the husband. His companion scurried away in horror. Beatrice looked back at the taxi she had to pay and saw that the car was gone too. The driver had chosen to leave. Who would want to get involved with a rowdy woman in a dirty sweatshirt and jeans, with unwashed, disheveled black hair? She couldn't explain to everyone that she had changed her clothes on purpose, not expecting that she would have to lie on the ground in the woods in this outfit. And then they wouldn't let her go home. All right, the taxi driver left and left. Now I have to deal with my husband. "Why are you hugging that woman here?" "Beatrice, don't. It's a work thing. We're just working together." "I'm sorry, Megan." This was already referring to his lady. "Quite pretty, by the way." And then he turned to his wife again. "You're alive, my darling. How happy I am." I didn't believe it, though they found some remains in the car. "Remains of what? Me, or what? Did you want to bury my burnt socks, or what was found there?" "My clothes are on me, you see. Jewelry, too." "Okay, if this was purely an office hug, I'm sorry, Megan, or whatever your name is. My husband and I need to go to the police, as although I wasn't murdered, I was very much wanted. John, let's go." Her husband politely said goodbye to his colleague, and with the same dazed look followed Beatrice to the police station, trying to clarify things along the way. She had calmed down a little, but she could not explain what had happened. She didn't understand. At the police station, she told everything that had happened, without mentioning the father and son living in the forest. The investigator recorded her statement, opened a criminal case, and promised to look into everything. Beatrice noticed that her husband was nervous, and this made her suspicious. When they left the station, she made no effort to hide it from John. "I saw you on TV talking about what happened. You mentioned that I might have had a lot of money on me. How did you know about it?" "What do you mean, how? You said yourself it was possible. So I said it was probably true. After all, you had the money on you. I just figured that in that case the search would move more aggressively." "And how did you identify my stuff?" "Is this an interrogation?" "I answered all the questions at the police station." "Did you recognize it?" "What could I recognize?" "They showed me some charred objects, so I said they could be yours." "I didn't say anything, I just said yes. Besides, they were taken from your car." "I don't know why you're asking me. It's weird, this whole thing." "All right, let the police handle it. But tell me, why did you change the locks on the house?" "Well, what's not to understand? I was advised to do so because your supposed death was criminal, and criminals are at large. It's not impossible that they would have come to our house as well to find more. There were no keys found in the car, not even the burnt ones, which means the perpetrators have them. I don't understand why you're so suspicious of me. You put up a fight, embarrassed me in front of my colleague." "Well, I did apologize, although I don't quite understand why you have to hug your colleagues, and with such a happy look. And that's despite the fact that your wife is probably dead. You know, I didn't believe in doom. Now I don't know what we're talking about. Do you suspect me of something?" "Of what?" Nothing, John. If I had any specific suspicions, I'd tell you." "All right, let's go home. I need to clean up and rest. I need to get on with my life. The business is falling apart. I don't care about suspicion. Let the police sort it out." She didn't really like her husband's behavior. It was indeed suspicious, but now she just wanted to rest. Beatrice suddenly realized that her attitude towards her husband had changed. She couldn't explain what it was, but somehow she couldn't trust him as she used to. Talking about it, she decided to put it off for later, because for now she had nothing concrete, only the certainty that her husband was hiding something. As she thought about it, Beatrice's thoughts returned again and again to the people who seemed so sincere, to the father and son living in the forest. She wanted to help them, or at least just see them one more time. And just the next day, realizing that she couldn't solve her problems yet, she started planning a trip to the forest. The first thing to do was to buy something that would make both of them happy. Truthfully, she didn't know what that might be. And she didn't even know what kind of games kids Alex's age played. What kind of medication would help his father? And so she bought mostly delicious and unusual foods that her new friends had certainly never seen before, as well as a few books and toys for the boy. Realizing that she could hardly fulfill all their wishes, Beatrice comforted herself with the thought that next time she would buy what they asked for. Arriving at the forest, Beatrice simply walked in the direction where she thought the hut was located, as she had promised Alex. It was a long walk. Besides, she now had a rather heavy rucksack on her back. For a moment, Beatrice wondered if she would get lost and reach the right place. But everything went exactly as the boy had predicted. First, the wolves met her, and then Alex himself jumped out of the thicket. "Aunt Beatrice, have you come?" He ran up and hugged her. Apparently, he did it rather out of surprise, because normally he was a rather reserved boy. Beatrice responded by hugging him tightly too and laughed happily. "Alex, it's so good to see you. I thought I was lost and would never get out, didn't I?" "Really? I told you we'd wait and greet you, didn't I? I really didn't think you'd come so soon, but I walked this way just in case. And I told the wolves to watch out for you too, didn't I? Let's go home soon. Papa will be very glad too." David expressed his emotions in a much more subdued way, but it was still evident that he, too, was glad to see an acquaintance from the big world. Beatrice pulled some guests out of her rucksack, somewhat embarrassed. "Sorry, maybe I didn't bring exactly what I needed. But I didn't know exactly what you'd want or what you were expecting. Didn't think to ask last time. But I hope this isn't the last time we meet." "We hope so too," Alex said, leafing through the books with interest. "And what do we want? We don't know ourselves, because I don't think we need anything special. We have everything. But it's true, you have everything so unusual. So thank you very much anyway. It's really wasted on you. I mean, thank you, of course. I'll put the kettle on now, we'll have lunch together. It's just a shame about the wolves. I didn't bring anything. I just don't know what they want. I mean, I understand that meat, let's say, but it's too heavy to carry, so I left them without any guests." "It's nothing," Alex assured her. "They won't be offended. They know how to get their own food. They are predators, after all. But they're happy to see you without any gifts. We are too, by the way." Beatrice realized that the boy was not used to many things that were commonplace to other children, but he had friends that modern children do not dream of. After lunch, Alex ran to play with the wolves. He was used to always be near them and spend as much time as possible in communication. The adults didn't mind, especially since they also had a conversation. Beatrice had already told David in more detail about what had happened to her. She did not hide the fact that her husband had aroused some suspicions. She also told him about the visit to the police. "Well, don't worry, David, I didn't mention you. I said I just spent the night in the woods. I realize you don't want to be found. Or would you like that after all?" "Do you know what, Beatrice? While I may want to, I'm even more afraid of it. You see, if Alex and I are found, they'll hardly rush to help us right away. Most likely they'll send me to some home for the disabled and him to a boarding school. We don't want that," the man said glumly. "Well, I understand you perfectly well, and you're probably right. But from the moment we met, I've been thinking about how I could help you, both of you, so that you wouldn't be separated, and at the same time change your lives for the better. I don't feel comfortable imposing, and if you don't mind, tell me I won't do it again. But I assure you, I won't do anything against your wishes. I want very much for you and Alex to be happy." While discussing this serious matter, Beatrice walked about the house, as was her custom. She did not know how to sit still. As she passed the curtain blocking David's bed, she caught it and noticed the picture of a beautiful woman hanging on the wall. She noticed it and froze. The face was familiar. She didn't immediately realize it was the same stranger her husband had hugged in the street. David noticed that the guest was interested in the portrait and explained, "That's my ex-wife. Don't think that I keep her portrait and hang it in plain sight because I still love her. I don't. And I can't even say that I loved her before, as I should have loved the mother of my son. Maybe it's my fault she's gone. And the portrait's just hanging there for no reason. To be honest, I wish Alex would never forget his mother, but for some reason he's not interested in her at all. And probably because she never treated him in a maternal way either and eventually left him. Why, that needs no explanation at all, said Beatrice, embarrassed. Just saw a portrait of a beautiful woman. That's all. And what's her name? Megan, came the expected reply. Beatrice decided not to mention that she had seen the woman. And quite recently, too. She thought she should probably talk to Megan herself first and find out why she had abandoned her son by making such a decision. She informed David that she was already packing for the return trip. I'd love to stay with you longer. I really like it here, but I have to go, things to do at home. And I don't even know where they will lead or where they will end up. Life has turned out to be a lot more complicated than I'd previously realized. Yeah, I wasn't quite prepared for this either. About your attempts to change our lives, I don't mind, but still, whatever you plan to do, please think properly. I don't want it to be for the worse. And in our case, it probably will be. Beatrice promised to be very careful, bade her farewell, and set out on her return journey. Alex accompanied her, as always, together with the wolves, and again they chatted about everything on the way. Again, Beatrice kissed him goodbye and said, "Perhaps I shall come again soon. I've learnt the road better now, so you needn't meet me. And I was thinking just now that since I have been so many times a guest of yours, it would be time for you to come and see me someday. I hope you won't mind?" "No, of course not," the boy rejoiced. "I'm always glad to. And Papa, I think, too. It's just a pity you can't take these ones with you." He pointed to his four-legged friends. "Yeah, can you imagine how horrified all the neighbors would be?" Beatrice laughed, waved her hand, and walked towards the train station. In town, she began her search for Megan. She did not dare to ask her husband directly. They rarely spoke at all after what had happened. It didn't seem like a quarrel, but rather as if they both suspected each other of something. The only thing Beatrice knew about Megan was her name, middle name, and that she worked with John at the same company. It was not insignificant, but it didn't make things much easier, as she didn't want to approach the employees to avoid gossip. After all, surely everyone was aware of their relationship, but there was no need to do so. Beatrice simply walked up to the office on her lunch break, and out of the door popped Joyce, the receptionist who considered herself the best friend of all the staff's wives. Unsurprisingly, she ran to John's spouse as well with a hug and a flood of sympathy. "Beatrice, I've heard of your misfortunes. How are you? The scoundrels are already being sought. I'm sure they will be found and punished. The police are very good. They're on that new TV show. You know, it's like 5 minutes to expose them all. Don't worry, take your vitamins. You're so pale. You should take care of yourself. Oh, you know what happened yesterday? One of us came into work looking pale. And suddenly, bang, she fainted. The ambulance came. They took her to the hospital. They said it was very bad." "Who was it? Wasn't it Sharon, that blonde?" Beatrice was wary, sensing that this meeting was no coincidence. "Ah, no, Sharon's fine, although she's been overdoing it on her diet. And Megan Wilson was taken away," Joyce faltered, apparently sensing she was talking about the wrong person. "Yeah, I know you hate to hear about her, but you know she's not doing well. Her health hasn't been good. I mean, really bad for a long time." Having parted from the talkative girl, Beatrice heaved a sigh of relief. She had learnt the name of the woman she was interested in and knew where she was now. She felt no sympathy for this Megan. She remembered that not only had she abandoned her sick husband and child, she was also in a relationship with her spouse. Sick. No wonder retribution has caught up with her. Must have been something feminine. But what is it? Why not visit the sick one? Beatrice went to the hospital. She was let in with a sympathetic look when she introduced herself as a relative. This already inspired some apprehension. Be that as it may, Beatrice clearly wished no harm to this woman. But as she entered the room, she realized that Megan's case was not good at all. It was no surprise that she had changed considerably since the portrait that now adorned the wall of the forest hut had been taken. People change. But the fact that she had changed so much in a couple of days was a complete surprise. Beatrice didn't even immediately realize that the woman in front of her was the same Megan. "Surprised?" she asked. Pale gray lips curved in a languid grin. "The very same Megan, your husband's mistress. You may rejoice, you have won. Soon I will be gone, and John will be yours alone." "Why do you say that? I didn't come for that at all. I'm sure you'll be all right. John and I are getting a divorce, so you can be together." Beatrice felt very sorry for having come here at all to see this unfortunate woman, whose days were in all probability numbered. But perhaps the fact that she would tell her that her son was alive and well would be a comfort to the dying woman. "Stop it. You don't have to comfort me. I'm glad you know about your husband, though it's strange that he's been lying to you for so long. We weren't a bad couple, but now it's ending. For almost 10 years I've been hoping I could beat this nasty thing. But no, it wasn't about John the first wanted to ask. I mean to tell you about your husband and son. I saw them just yesterday. You remember them, don't you?" Beatrice asked, tears springing to her eyes with pity. "I remember them, of course. Only I don't want them. They're alive and well, and all right. Yes, Beatrice, John and I are also a couple because of our fate. You lived with him and saw nothing. David believed me, but Alex isn't his child. He didn't realize. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I gave birth to him by your husband." "How could that happen?" "The boy is already 8 years old," Beatrice marveled. "So what? John and I have known each other since high school. I got pregnant by accident. We didn't expect to have children at all. What's the point? We were in the business of scams, and we were very successful. No time for kids, you know, moving around all the time. And then, out of the blue, we got pregnant. And that's when John was arrested. Yeah, well, it happens to the most successful con men. Thank you, he didn't give me up. On the contrary, he defended me. So I got David wrapped up before the belly was showing. I think the baby's going to be with its father. I'll be in the middle of nowhere for a while, but I won't be alone. That's an argument too, you'd agree." John sat. Beatrice couldn't believe she knew her husband so poorly. "Well, yes, 3 years before I even met you. And I've been sitting through that time with David and Alex. And when our John came out, I decided I'd had enough. And you didn't want to be with your child. And now you don't want to know anything about him either." Beatrice couldn't believe what she was hearing. Such indifference to her son struck her more than anything else. But perhaps Megan didn't care so much. Her face darkened. She turned away, painfully holding back. "I knew I was sick even then. That's why I didn't want him to get used to me. I knew I wouldn't live long. But I left David when John came out and he met you a while later. You think he fell in love? I don't get your hopes up. He was attracted to your business and money, and we've been with him all along." Megan appeared to be exhausted by this conversation. She leaned back on the pillow, breathing heavily. "But we were careful, since you didn't even realize. So let's have no hard feelings. I don't have long now, you see for yourself. So we'll be together while I'm alive. It's not good for you, but you can't do that. Maybe you could get some help. Need anything?" Beatrice really wanted to help this woman. "I don't need anything. I've already got everything I'm due." Beatrice left, and her heart felt very heavy. Too many new things had been learnt that day. She did not know how to speak to her husband afterwards. It was clear that they could not be together. Well, if he's a crook and married her only for money, then isn't he the one who had something to do with the robbery she was the victim of? In this case, only divorce will not end the matter. But she never spoke to her husband that day. He did not come home. Beatrice suspected that the husband in the hospital had his beloved. Turns out he was. Megan had died in his arms. Beatrice sincerely sympathized with both the young woman who died and even her husband, albeit an ex-husband. She had taken part in organizing the funeral, which actually only she and John had attended. Yes, some grandmother, either a hospital nurse or some distant relative. John wept bitterly over the coffin, but soon he was arrested. The investigation was active, and it was already clear that he was the organizer of the robbery. Beatrice was present at the confrontation, at which her ex-husband, without looking at her, confessed candidly. "I had a huge debt. I lost at cards and nobody was going to forgive me. There was no money, and I learnt that my wife was going to carry a large sum of money." To hear Beatrice say all this was unbearable. It turned out that John had organized not only the robbery, but also the attempted murder. He wanted her gone, to be burned in that car. The bandits decided not to take an unnecessary sin on their souls. That is, they took her to the woods and tied her to a tree. They hoped she would die of her own accord, eaten by wild animals, and at least it wouldn't be at their hands. The investigation was long and agonizing for Beatrice. Because of this, she did not visit her acquaintances in the forest for a long time. It was at the very end of the summer that she did get out to David and Alex to break the sad news of Megan's death. She told, after all, the deceased was his wife. But about the fact that he is raising a son who is not his own, did not talk. But it turned out that David knew it from the beginning. The news of Megan's death had left him almost indifferent. "Caught up with her," was all he said, and asked, "Don't tell Alex." "I won't tell Alex yet either. Maybe he'll find out when he wants to. He's too young now. He has never asked about her much. Thanks to her, there's a lot of things he doesn't need to know. I knew I wasn't his father. I met her when she was pregnant. She tried to convince me that it was from me, but who would believe it if she gave birth 7 months after meeting me? But I saw that it was very hard for her. She was alone. She told me that too when we met shortly before she died. Alex's father is my husband's ex. I mean, he and I didn't know each other at the time, and now we're divorced. And he's back in prison. This time for a much longer period of time. But really, it's better that Alex doesn't know. By the way, I have a proposition for you. I told you I want to help you get out of the woods and into the city. I've been thinking about it a lot. And here's what I've got. My firm needs a head of security, and I'm offering you this place with accommodation. We'll draw up all the documents for you and your son, and he'll go to school." "Are you kidding? What head of security?" "In case you haven't noticed, I'm in a wheelchair," David grinned. "Yes, I have noticed. But I'm not a security guard, I'm a supervisor. You don't have to guard anything there. You'll just be sitting in your office, watching everything on the monitors, giving orders to the guards. It's not that hard, and the pay's not bad. It's enough for you and your son, and you can come here in the summer if you want, like a holiday home." David thought for a while, but called his son to the council for a final agreement. Alex's face stretched. He liked the proposal less than his father. The first thing he did was to speak out on the issue that most concerned him. "What about the wolves? You can't take them with you." "Well, of course not. But they are free-loving animals. They will live in the forest, and we will visit them," Dad promised. "I mean, they'll miss us. And so will I. And I'll worry about them. After all, the hunters might come, and then, well, there's no stopping the hunters from coming in front of us. It's good that you love animals so much, but you shouldn't give up your own life for them." Alex, after thinking for a while, agreed, but without much willingness. He was concerned about his friends, but no less afraid of the very human life that his father and Beatrice were trying to seduce him with. He did not find schooling, obedience to teachers, socializing with other boys so attractive at all. He was used to something quite different. Beatrice understood this, and David understood it too. But they were also well aware that he needed to go out into the world. Soon father and son moved to the city. Beatrice gave them 2 rooms in her house, and by the 1st of September, Alex was enrolled in school. David, on the other hand, went to work. Neither father nor son were particularly happy about this change in life. David realized that it was silly to be ashamed of his disability, but he still felt very uncomfortable in his chair among ordinary people. Even though everyone treated him well, he felt out of place. Maybe not so much because of his disability, but simply because he was not used to living among people. The city, with its rhythm of life, was deeply alien to him, but he had a dream. He dreamed of saving up money for an operation. Even when he was lying in hospital after the wound, the doctor said that recovery was possible, but he had to be treated, and treatment costs money, which they did not have, as well as there was no hope of earning it. But now, thanks to his new position, there was hope. David realized that he had to get used to the normal life he had grown accustomed to during his years in the forest. Alex found it even harder. He was not used to anything because he had never known ordinary life, and he had to learn everything. He had come to school with an open heart, hoping that, as Aunt Beatrice and Papa had promised him, he would find new friends with whom he would have as much fun as with the wolves. But things turned out differently. The boy did not hide anything. He told the boys where and how he used to live, told them about his four-legged friends. But instead of friendship, he received ridicule. His life seemed rather strange to the ordinary home kids. Some thought that he was just lying, and that he had never had any night wolves, but just lived somewhere in a remote village. Alex was immediately given the nickname Mowgli, and was called only that, which offended the boy very much. He was well developed physically, and in case of what could fight back, and therefore other guys were afraid to bully him too much, but nobody wanted to be friends with him either. At school, Alex held back, tried to keep himself independent, but when he came home, he often cried. When Beatrice caught him crying, she asked him, "What's the matter?" And Alex honestly answered, "You shouldn't have brought us out here. I miss the wolves. It'll be winter soon. They'll be cold. I mean, they're still very young. Besides, I'm afraid of hunters and evil people in general. We'll go to the forest during the holidays and you'll go and see them. I'm sure they'll be fine. Wolves are not little dogs that will disappear without people. Besides, they're smart and sensitive. They know how to avoid danger." Beatrice tried to comfort him. "Yes, that may be true," Alex agreed. "But I feel bad here myself. I feel as if I were a wolf who had come to the city and couldn't find his place among people. I don't like it at all. I don't like the school. I don't like the guys either. I haven't made any friends and I never will. Only enemies, I guess." "You will. I'm sure you will. You're just not used to it yet, and they're not used to you. You're from very different places, after all, and it's nothing strange that you didn't like it right away. But it's really nice here. Can't you see that it's much more comfortable for you and your dad?" These entreaties calmed Alex a little, and Beatrice hoped that gradually the boy would get used to it. David, she thought, was easier. He was settling into the job quickly. And although he didn't get along with people, he didn't feel any negativity. Or maybe he was just hiding it. After all, he was a man, not a little boy, and it was understandable that he would be ashamed to complain. Beatrice would have loved to help them both, but she realized that they were proud people, and to impose her help on them would be to offend them. But she wanted to help them, especially David. She had already consulted the doctors and knew that surgery would help him. But she didn't dare to just give the money. She knew he would refuse. David quickly got into the business, observed the work of the whole team, and finally noticed that something wrong was going on. Several employees, clearly in collusion, decided, it seems, to ruin Beatrice. By identifying the intruders in time, David was able to avert a serious danger. Beatrice was delighted with the timely actions of the head of security, and in gratitude still decided to offer to pay him for the operation. "I beg you very much, David, don't refuse," she urged him. "Take it simply as a bonus. You realize that if you hadn't noticed in time, I would have lost a great deal more." "Beatrice, well, it's just my job. I appreciate your attitude, but the bonus has to be adequate. And you're offering the kind of money I won't make for many years along with all the bonuses." David refused quite expectedly. "There's no need to exaggerate. All right, if you refuse to be grateful, then let the sum count as borrowed. You'll pay it back from every salary, that's all. I know you're saving up for the operation, so let's do it right away. I appreciate your ego, but you have to be reasonable." "Okay, I agree with you. But aren't you rejoicing that the conspiracy has been uncovered too soon? After all, the instigators were never identified. Could you give out this bonus after I've fully investigated the case? You'll figure it out much faster when you're on your feet. And that won't happen until after the surgery. And don't you realize that not only do you need you at work, but your son needs you healthy?" David agreed and went to the hospital. Perhaps it was premature. The intruders, taking advantage of his absence, decided to put pressure on Beatrice and still force her to sign the documents on the ownership of the company. The easiest way to do this was with the help of Alex. One day the boy was kidnapped and taken away to an unknown destination. At first Alex was frightened. He was roughly grabbed, put on the back seat of the car and told to keep quiet. But the kidnappers themselves did not keep silent, apparently fearing nothing. Where are we going to keep him? He could run away, or make a fuss. We can't just keep him in the basement of a building, can we? I've got a place in mind. A gamekeeper used to live there a while back, very principled. So I shot him to keep him out of the way while hunting. I don't know what happened to him, but his hut is still there. Yeah, maybe there's no people around, no matter what you shout or scream. And Alex realized that he was being taken to his and his father's house. It calmed him down. He knew the neighborhood very well. Besides, he had loyal friends there, and soon Alex's kidnappers got to know them. It was impossible to pass by car, so they had to walk. But not for long, the wolves ran out of the forest. Having heard the boy's call, and quickly realizing what was happening, pounced on his enemies. Alex only had to use the kidnapper's phone and call for help. Soon the kidnappers were in for a real beating. Alex was taken home right into the arms of an anxious Beatrice, who couldn't wait to tell David the good news. The operation Dad had undergone had been a success. When David returned home, he found his son and Beatrice no longer just friends, but family. He himself had to undergo rehabilitation, during which his relationship with Beatrice became closer. A year later at their wedding, he confidently walked with a cane, and soon it became clear that there was even more incentive for a speedy recovery. His young wife announced that they would soon have a baby boy. Emily woke up at 0700 hours as usual. She didn't even need an alarm clock. If a body knows when it's time to get up. The bedroom was silent. Only the light sniffling of Jason, sleeping peacefully next to her, broke the silence. Emily slipped carefully out of bed, careful not to wake her husband. She took a couple steps and stretched sweetly. Feeling a pleasant heaviness in her body after yesterday's busy day, full of creative work, she remembered how she had finished painting the children's room in soft pastel colors. The customers, a young middle-income family, were delighted. "Thank you very much. Our daughter now thinks she lives in a fairy tale world," said customer Jennifer. "You're welcome. May my work bring your daughter joy, peace, and comfort," Emily replied with a smile. It gave her strength and confidence despite the constant doubts and ridicule from some people close to her. This was especially true of Jason, her husband, a middle-aged businessman who had spent his life striving for stability and traditional values. Unfortunately, he had never understood Emily's passion for painting, considering it a frivolous occupation that brought no real income and no confidence in the future. "It's your paint strokes again," Jason often said. "When are you going to get a real job? It's already embarrassing for Mom. How are we going to live on your art? It's a good thing my business keeps us fed." Sabara, the mother-in-law, was even more critical and never missed an opportunity to jab her daughter-in-law with sarcastic remarks. "So Emily, you're fiddling with your colors again. When will you finally find a proper job that would be of some use to the family? Why don't you go work as a manager or a secretary, or have you decided to become a great artist? I hope you're not wasting our money on those pointless activities. It's good that our surname in the registry office did not take, or else the shame of this mess." The phrase came out scathing and very painful, but it didn't bother Barbara. Emily tried to ignore the sarcastic attacks, but sometimes they hurt. Of course, she knew that Jason and his mother didn't share her passion for art, didn't see anything of value in it but meaningless scribbles on canvases. Sometimes it seemed as if Barbara deliberately chose her moments to jab her, to humiliate her, to make her feel like a failure. But, on the other hand, her mother-in-law didn't work anywhere herself, and wasn't even going to look for something suitable. It seemed that everything suited her. The son works and she is engaged in the upbringing of a stubborn daughter-in-law, since God hadn't given her a grandchild. But today Emily had a special feeling. A few days ago she had placed an ad on a freelance website, and had been waiting impatiently for any response ever since. Her mood was elevated, as if a premonition of something good was in the air. She made her way to the kitchen where Barbara was preparing breakfast. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the place, but the atmosphere was tense. "Good morning," Emily said, trying to speak cheerfully, though inside her, she was clenching with the anticipation of another round of ridicule. She had never called her mother-in-law mother, as she believed there could only be one mother. "Morning, Emily," Barbara replied without turning around. "You're awake already. Then it's time to get to work. Pick up a paintbrush." Jason, who had just entered the kitchen, looked tired, but when he noticed Emily, he frowned. "Didn't you check your work email? I need to find some important documents." "The laptop is glitching again," he said, sipping his coffee. "No, Jason, I haven't looked yet. I'll do it after breakfast," said Emily, who was also keeping an eye on all the gadgets in the house. "It'll have to be quick. It's urgent, actually," her husband grumbled unhappily. Emily, not wanting to continue the argument, retreated to the living room to check her email on her home laptop. She turned on the computer, expecting to see more emails with promotional offers and other spam. Opening the mailbox, she saw a message from an unknown address. Judging by the subject line, it was an order to paint walls in a country house. Her heart fluttered with joy. She quickly opened the letter and could hardly contain her excitement. It was a solid order, a mural with a unique Art Nouveau design. "Finally something worthwhile," Emily exclaimed. Unable to contain her emotion, she excitedly ran her eyes over the details of the order. The style, the color, the customer's special requests. "Unbelievable. I can finally prove to Jason and Barbara that I'm still worth something," she whispered and covered her face with her hands. Overjoyed, she immediately rushed to call her husband and mother-in-law to share the news. "Jason, look," Emily exclaimed, showing the screen. "I've been sent a large original order." Her husband grinned in disbelief as he looked at the screen. "Emily, are you sure this isn't a joke? Or maybe it's just another attempt to swindle you out of money under the pretense of a job?" "No, it's really a real job. Here, look at the details, the terms and conditions. It's a serious job that can bring a good profit," Emily exclaimed. "And how could it be? And don't get your hopes up. At best, they'll pay like last time, $0.003. Barbara snorted. "Or maybe the customer just decided to have fun making fun of your naivete." Tears glistened in Emily's eyes. "Barbara, please. There's no need to exaggerate. This is a chance for me to show what I can do." "Well, then show it. I hope you won't ask me for money to buy paints," her mother-in-law remarked sarcastically. Her words hurt. Emily felt her eyes begin to fill with tears, but still held back, realizing she shouldn't give in to her emotions. "I can handle it and do it myself," she said, trying to suppress the tremor in her voice. "Of course you will. Who would mind? Just don't forget, I warned you. And don't expect me to help you with my advice," Barbara said dismissively. Jason noticed that the wife is upset. Emily tried to smooth things over. "Let's talk about this another time. I've got an important business trip coming up, and you've got a fine arts discussion going on." "Okay, son, that's up to you. Just remember these paints and brushes are already here. I'm fed up. You'd better think of your children. 5 years of marriage and still no grandchild. My friends are laughing at me. They say that soon they will give me grandchildren on rent, so that I will not get bored," exclaimed her mother-in-law. Emily didn't answer, just nodded and left the room. She needed to be alone for a while, to calm down, to gather her thoughts. Already in her room, she opened the letter again and began to scrutinize the details of the order. First of all, she had to develop a sketch, coordinate it with the client, and then start working. "I will definitely do it and prove them wrong," Emily whispered like an incantation. After thinking for a moment, she picked up the paints and brushes on the table and began to create. It seemed that with her stroke, not only sketches for future rooms were born, but also for a new life, full of colors and self-confidence. Emily spent most of the day at work, sketching, working out details and thinking through the composition. She wanted to create something special that would impress the customer and make everyone who doubted her redoubt consider their opinion. But finally the sketch was ready, and she sent it to the client with bated breath, waiting for a reply. Several hours passed. Emily couldn't concentrate on anything, constantly double-checking her email. All day she had been flying like she was on wings. It seemed as if she could roll mountains. Even her husband and mother-in-law seemed less annoying. Finally, the long-awaited reply came. "Your sketch is amazing," the customer wrote. "We are delighted with your work. We want to work with you." Emily could not believe her eyes. She liked her sketch and got a good order. Happy, she hurried to tell Jason and Barbara about it. "Look," exclaimed Emily, showing the letter. "They have accepted my sketch. I have received the order. Let's start work." Her husband looked at her with a certain irony in his eyes, though he didn't hold out much hope that Emily would actually be able to get the order. "But I'm glad it worked out this way. I hope you don't regret your choice," he said as if reluctantly. Barbara, who was sitting in the chair, smirked meaningfully, making it clear that she didn't believe in her sister-in-law in any way. The next day, armed with a navigator and a good mood, Emily went to the customers. The difficulty was that there were 2 streets with the same name in the city. And for some reason, the connection with a customer was cut off at the most interesting place. But Emily did not despair, decided to find the house she needed by the method of elimination. Country Cottage Village turned out to be quiet and cozy. Beautiful, neat houses drowning in greenery lined up leisurely along the winding paths. Emily could hardly get her bearings. The address on the letter wasn't very informative. Finally, she found the right 2-story house with panoramic windows, surrounded by a high fence. The door was opened by a young woman with a cold, almost indifferent look. The owner of the house was dressed expensively, but not flashily: white pants, a strict sweater. "Who are you?" she asked instead of greeting, not inviting her guest into the house. "I'm Emily Lebedeva, a decorative artist. You asked me to paint the walls," Emily replied, a little embarrassed. The landlady frowned, as if remembering something. That was a quick response. "I guess the contractors who did my roof have been fast. All right, come on in. I'll show you the nursery. By the way, my name is Victoria." "No middle name," the woman said, as if she didn't need anything. Emily shrugged and followed, knowing full well that their correspondence had been about painting the whole house, not just the nursery. What did it matter, though? Maybe she'd just changed her mind. They the rich, as they say, 7 Fridays in a week. The house was almost perfectly clean. Everything was neat and tidy, without a single superfluous detail. Victoria led her with an indifferent look into the children's room, a spacious, bright room with large windows. "Here," she said, pointing to an empty wall, "I want you to paint it. The theme is nautical, blue and white tones and some gold. No cartoon characters, just waves, ships. Just to make it nice and classy." "I see," Emily said. Looking around the room, "I like your idea." "What about the cost?" Victoria asked, looking at Emily with undisguised irony. "I can put together an estimate with materials and the complexity of the job. It will take about a couple weeks in total," Emily replied, again surprised that she had already chatted about this topic in correspondence. "In 2 weeks. That's actually a long time," Victoria replied grudgingly. "But it takes time to procure the materials and, of course, to paint the murals. It's handmade," Emily explained. Victoria was silent for a few seconds, then nodded in agreement. "Okay, go ahead and do it, if that's the way you want to do it. You just saved me the trouble of picking out paint and so on." "Of course I'll do it, don't worry," Emily replied readily. Then she asked cautiously, "Where's your son and what's his name?" The question was asked seemingly naturally, but the expression on Victoria's face changed dramatically. Her eyes narrowed with displeasure, her lips compressed into a solid, thin line. "Kirill is out with the nanny right now. Don't worry," Victoria cut her off. Emily felt uncomfortable. It suddenly seemed to her that the question had made Victoria irritated, maybe even angry. So that was why she didn't dare to insist, though a strange feeling had arisen in her soul. It felt like Victoria was treating her child with some inexplicable disdain and coolness. Emily said goodbye and walked out of the house. Her mood had soured a little. She knew perfectly well that order was good and money was even better, but working in such a strange place was not what she wanted at all. Emily took a few steps down the path as she suddenly heard a baby crying. It was coming from somewhere on the street. She stopped. She listened. The cry was loud, shrill, and desperate. God, what's happened to that baby? Emily thought, looking around. At that moment, the nanny came out from around the corner of the house, a tall, stout woman with a sullen face. She was leading by the hand a boy about 6 years old who was sobbing uncontrollably. "What's wrong with him?" Emily asked anxiously. "He fell off his bike," the woman replied without looking at Emily. "It's nothing to worry about. That Johnny's always getting into stories. My name's Sarah. And you must be the new girl, right?" Emily was visibly embarrassed. No, I'm a scenic artist. I'm going to be painting walls." Sarah grinned. "I see. It's my last day working here today, and the landlady is still a problem customer, and the little boy is no better. And it's always my punishment. The landlady goes to the restaurant, has fun, and I have to sit with my son. No privacy. I haven't been replaced in 4 days. None of them can stand it, not a child, but a problem." Emily didn't believe it. Her intuition told her that the boy was being cranky for a reason. The boy with the big gray eyes was breathing rapidly, his body shaking with sobs. "Could he be in pain?" Emily asked. "Oh, none of your business. We had a physical with him the other day, so he's fine." The nanny cut her off. Emily wanted to object, but then changed her mind, realizing that there seemed to be no room for goodwill or sympathy in this family. It was as if the whole place was imbued with indifference to one another. With a disapproving glance at Emily, Sarah went into the house with Johnny. Back at her place, Emily tried to avoid talking to her mother-in-law, who appeared to be eagerly awaiting her return. "What? Have you worked so fast already? I thought at least you wouldn't be slacking on your first day of work," Barbara said. Emily turned pale. "And who told you I was slacking? I've actually been familiarizing myself with the front of the work, communicating with the client." Barbara shook her head. "That's what your job is all about. Communication, communication, communication. And the output is nothing. Nothing. That's right. The lazy, like the hunchback, can only be reformed by the grave." Tears glistened in Emily's eyes. But why did all mothers-in-law have mothers-in-law? And why did she get this snake in human form? A mother-in-law should be a second mother to her daughter-in-law, so that she feels her love and care. And here what? Only reproaches from morning till night. If you pay attention to your husband, the house is wrong again. You don't bring enough money. And you can't give birth to children. If you make a lot of money, Barbara will have another reason. If only she wanted to. Emily decided not to argue and went to her room. Why spoil her mood when she had very little left? Barbara would never be satisfied. You could walk around on your head or sing karaoke songs. You'll only get your share of negativity. Since Jason had gone on another business trip, Emily spent the rest of the evening in her room. She didn't want to eat dinner, nor did she want to see his mother's disgruntled face in the kitchen. Barbara had become a real guardian of the refrigerator. As soon as Emily got a couple of eggs for an omelet, her mother-in-law was there. "Emily, that's my son's money. Or have you forgotten? Get yourself a separate shelf in the refrigerator and eat with your own money. I already gave you everything I earned a couple days ago. It's a decent amount by the standards of our town," Emily countered. Barbara's face immediately turned crimson at those words, and she looked like one big tomato. "Decent money? Beggars on the porch have more than that. I'd rather you stood under the church with your hand out. You'd get more use out of it." Usually Emily's nervous system couldn't stand the second minute of such communication, and she went straight to her room. Like this. Left alone with her paints and sketchbook, the moment when the muse comes to the creator is truly beautiful. In the room, filled with the smell of coffee and watercolors, there was a creative atmosphere. Emily was completely absorbed in creating a comic book, reflecting her life on paper. Lively. Juxtaposed with the black and white sketches, the colored drawings were like stills from an old movie. Here is little Emily with big eyes running barefoot on a green lawn, behind which spread golden fields of wheat. Nearby, a good-natured grandfather in a straw hat checks the beehives, and a grandmother with wrinkles around her eyes smiles as she looks at her granddaughter. And it was a graphic story of her own life, full of sunny summer days in the country, the smell of honey, and Grandma Barbara's mysterious predictions. Emily, with fingertips stained with purple and blue paint, thoughtfully applied strokes, giving life to her little world drawn on paper. "Need to add some pink," the woman murmured. And this is where Emily enjoyed drawing the apiary. Grandpa Johnny is teaching her to distinguish between flower honey and buckwheat honey, and she keeps getting confused, too caught up in the golden color. In the memory of the young artist, one bright pictures popped up. The summer sun floods the meadows with golden light, the fragrance of blooming linden, honeycomb, full of sweet, thick nectar. And here on the next sketch, Johnny with a beard, looking like a furry dandelion, in a stretchy robe tells stories about the life of bees and how important it is to take care of nature. "Why are bees so hardworking?" little Emily asked then, looking at the insects swirling around the flowers. She still remembered the sticky honey dripping down her hands and her grandfather laughing as he wiped her face with a soft towel. And here, Barbara's easily recognizable profile appeared on a piece of paper. Emily depicted her grandmother as stern but kind, with an amber necklace and wrinkles around her eyes, like a map with ancient secrets. "Grandma, why do you always look at people's hands, the ones who come to see you?" Emily asked, climbing into her lap. "And because a person's fate is written on them," answered Granny, stroking her small palm. "Each line has its own story, its joys, its sorrows." Barbara knew almost everything about people, saw the future, read their destinies. Emily often sat next to her grandmother, mesmerized by her calmness and wisdom. "You're going to be an artist," Grandma said one day, gazing into the lines of Emily's palm. "You will create beauty, and people will rejoice in your creations." Childhood contained a warm gallery of bright sunny colors, and then Emily's life was filled with gray, rainy days. Mama Sarah was gone, leaving behind only emptiness and pain. Emily was just a little girl, only 5 years old, and didn't understand why her mom didn't smile anymore, and why her eyes were so sad after visiting her uncle's doctor at the district hospital. And then she disappeared, leaving only a kind memory in a grave mound with a cross in the local cemetery. "Mommy went to the stars in the sky," Grandma said, trying to explain the irreparable loss to Emily. "She became a stargazer, too, and now she's taking care of us." Remembering this, Emily drew a sad scene. The little girl standing looking up at the sky, bitter tears rolling down her cheeks. Then Daddy left, though not to heaven, but to another family, leaving Emily in the care of her grandparents. The little girl felt abandoned, unwanted. "Why doesn't Daddy love me?" Emily cried, huddled against her grandmother. "Why did he leave me?" "He just doesn't know how to love. Not all people are capable of real feelings," Barbara said quietly. And at the same moment, Emily pictured her father in the comic strip, walking away somewhere in the distance. Here was his figure growing smaller and smaller, and Emily herself standing with her head down, feeling alone, betrayed. "But I will love you always. You're the only ray of light in my life," Grandma whispered. Emily grew up, graduated from high school. Johnny's grandfather had died by then. A stroke took him away. Grandma was left alone, but nevertheless found the strength to go on living. Emily realized that she had to leave the village to find herself in the big city, to become independent. She went back to the comic book, drew herself as a student, diligently studying textbooks and preparing for exams, and then depicted standing in front of an easel with a brush in her hand, surrounded by bright colors. In the city, Emily went to university, chose the profession of artist decorator. She studied, worked, dreamed, and also created beauty, enlivened the walls of houses with her drawings. She depicted flowers, birds, different landscapes. All her works without exception were full of light and joy. "Emily, you are very talented," the professor told her. "You have golden hands." "Thank you, Arkady Petrovich," she answered, feeling her heart fill with warmth. "I just love my work." She continued to draw. On the next drawing depicted herself sitting in a cozy cafe with a cup of coffee. Next to her is an unfamiliar young man, dark-haired, handsome, smiling and looking at Emily with tenderness, Jason. There's no doubt in her mind that it's really him. So they met in the park, where Emily was entertaining the kids by drawing with colored crayons on the pavement. A tall, slender guy approached her and smiled. "Your work is a marvel," Jason said. "You're a real magician." She was embarrassed, blushing. Emily had never heard such words before, much less from a young man. "Thank you. It's a pleasure." "May I meet you?" the guy asked. "My name is Jason." "And I'm Emily," the girl replied, feeling her heart start to beat faster. And next in the comic book, with a few strokes, she reproduced their first meeting. She had Jason looking at her with a gentle gaze and a smile. Flowers, sunshine, and joy all around them. "Emily, I love you," Jason said one day, holding her hand. "You are my life and my inspiration at the same time." Emily wasn't lazy and immediately drew the kiss and her smile on paper. The full happiness was on the scrapbook. There was also a place for her mother-in-law, whom the young artist depicted as a fire-breathing dragon. Only, unlike the fairy tale character, Barbara did not generate flames at all, but waves of criticism and curses. Emily finished drawing, leaned back in her chair, and smiled. The story of her life, full of joy, sadness, love, and loss, was written on paper in bright, vibrant colors. The next morning she came again to Victoria's cottage, armed with paints, brushes, and finished sketches. The landlady greeted her as coldly as the first time. "I hope you can manage," Victoria said. "Don't worry, I'll be fine," Emily replied and began to work. The first few hours passed in silence. Victoria only appeared in the nursery to make sure the work was going according to plan. Emily tried to ignore the cold attitude and concentrated only on her work. Sometimes it seemed to her that she was depicting something deeper and more meaningful than just the sea. Toward evening, while working on a sketch of a sailing ship, Emily heard a child's voice behind her. "Auntie, what are you drawing?" Emily lowered her eyes and saw Johnny standing in the doorway, small, skinny, with big, sad eyes. "A sailboat," she answered and smiled. "It's beautiful," said Johnny. "Can you tell stories?" "Yes, I like to tell stories." The boy looked at her with interest. "Can you tell me two, or at least one?" Emily nodded in agreement, and sitting down on the floor, invited Johnny to join in. Then, after going over a few stories in her head, she began to talk about the sea, ships, and faraway lands. Johnny listened with bated breath. His eyes glistened with delight, and he had a sweet smile on his face. He asked questions and listened again. At some point, Emily felt a special connection between them. She also realized that the boy needed affection, attention, warmth. Emily was so engrossed in the conversation that she didn't even notice Victoria entering the room. The hostess had an angry expression on her face. "What's going on here? I don't understand. What are you doing? Entertaining my son or still work and fulfill your direct duties?" The young artist flinched in surprise and dropped the brush from her hands, which fell to the protective film-covered floor. The paint left small reddish stains on it. Sarah wrinkled her nose. "For this to be the first and last time, I need quality from you, not that you're going to come in here for a month and beat the cormorant," she said. "Okay, Sarah Alexeyevna, I'll do it all." Emily came to her senses and looked guiltily into the boy's eyes. Johnny lowered his nose and wandered into the other room that temporarily served as his nursery. Emily didn't know what reason Sarah had for being so cold to her son. And anyway, why didn't such a good boy have babysitters lingering around? In Emily's opinion, Johnny was a great kid and was only a little cranky for his age. Perhaps if Sarah had spent more time with him, he would have opened up to her like a delicate flower in the sunlight. But for some reason Sarah didn't, and looked at her son as if he were not of her blood, but some sort of servant. The end of the workday came out crumpled. The pleasure she'd gotten from talking to Johnny had been marred by a caustic remark from Sarah, who for some unknown reason had suddenly acted so aggressively. For a moment, it seemed to Emily that she was talking to two different people through email. Finished for the day, she closed the room and headed for the exit. "If you need an advance, take it from the desk," she tossed over her shoulder to Sarah, who had either decided to make up or was contemplating spurring her employee onto more action with money. "Thank you, Sarah Alexeyevna. But I have the money. That's better later, when I finish the whole work," Emily answered already in the doorway. In fact, the money was very much needed, especially given Barbara's constant nagging. But on the other hand, if Emily gave the deposit to her mother-in-law, where was the guarantee that tomorrow she would not again present her with new claims. After weighing the pros and cons, Emily mentally commended herself for not taking the deposit. Truth be told, she felt a certain anxiety about how Sarah would evaluate the final result of her work. Emily had already had a case when the customer had not paid anything. It was a small thing. Jason had offered to sort it out, to involve the right people, capable of extracting debts from anyone. But Emily hadn't wanted to, and deep down she'd been hurt by the customer's rejection, who hadn't appreciated her talent. With Jason still on a business trip, she didn't want to rush home. And what was waiting for her there? The barber's disgruntled face, who'd been sitting at home all day, bored with the scandals, and just waiting for a chance to pick on her sister-in-law again. Deciding to go to the store and buy something tasty, Emily turned toward the nearest supermarket. It was crowded at that time, and the long lines at the checkout line suggested that Emily had come during rush hour. Emily didn't feel bad, though, and picked up her basket and began to browse the shelves of groceries. Suddenly, her attention was caught by the security guard's shout. "What's all the fumbling about? Who let him in here? Get out of here. I know you. You drive your wheelchairs in here and then search you at the gatehouse." Emily turned around and saw an indignant man, about 35 years old in a wheelchair, looking sadly at the guard and trying to explain that he wasn't a thief, just going to buy bread and milk. "Yes, I know you. What bread do you want? You've probably come here for vodka. You've gotten so brazen lately that you've started drinking alcohol without leaving the store. Could you have a drink and then put the bottle back? What am I supposed to do? Pay for the shortage out of my own pocket?" The guard insisted. The customers looked at the unhappy man with obvious displeasure and shook their heads. Some of them really thought that he was a vagrant who was trying to make everyone feel sorry for him, but in fact he was not disabled. But for some reason, Emily immediately sensed that this man really needed help. Approaching the guard, she gently touched him by the sleeve of his uniform jacket and said, "Excuse me, you can let this man through. I know him well. He's not a vagrant." The guard turned around and gave Emily a disgruntled look. "What? You know him just like that? Would you say he's your neighbor or work colleague?" Emily barely suppressed a smile and furtively winked at the stranger sitting in the wheelchair. "Yes, he is indeed my neighbor. He lives at 15 Oak Street. I declare with full responsibility he will not steal anything from the store. He is not a thief." The guard was visibly embarrassed as the situation prevented him from venting all his aggression on her. "But since you know him, then you watch him yourself. Keep in mind, if he steals something, you'll be the one to pay at the cash register. And in 3 times the amount, taking into account the fine," threw the guard in farewell and stepped aside, looking for a new victim with his eyes. "Thank you. That was very helpful. I'm really not a thief or a vagrant," the man began to justify himself, running his hands over the wheels of the stroller. Emily smiled. "Oh, come on, I get it. Those guards are just waiting for someone to take their anger out on. The pay isn't great. You're in uniform all day, looking for trespassers. And when you do it day in and day out, every customer seems like a criminal. And that's why all kinds of misunderstandings happen. Doctors call it professional burnout." The man looked at his new acquaintance with interest. "Do you have anything to do with medicine?" Emily shook her head. "Actually, no, I'm an artist. But I've read books on psychology. I know a little about it." The man smiled, then said, "I, on the other hand, have everything to do with medicine. Or rather, I did. My name is Michael Thompson. I'm a general practitioner by profession. I've had a lot in the past, a home, a family, a job. But that all changed after that accident in the mountains. The safety rope broke, and I plummeted into the abyss." Emily froze in place with surprise. "So how did you get out of that gorge?" Michael paused for a moment, as if tasting the words. Then he continued, still turning the wheels of the stroller toward the shelves of freshly baked goods. "How did you get out?" "Well, it's a long story. Anyway, no one was looking for me. The rescuers refused because of the danger of an avalanche. So I crawled through snow and rocks for several days until I got to the river, and their fishermen picked me up. They called a rescue helicopter." Emily looked sadly at the spot where Michael's legs should have been. Only now did she notice that his injured limbs were orphaned by a woolen blanket. apparently so as not to shock anyone around him. Intercepting her gaze, he nodded understandingly. I was diagnosed with frostbite. I begged the doctors to save my legs. I am a doctor myself, a colleague. But it seems that it was not fate. Gangrene developed, and then blood poisoning began. The surgeon simply had no other choice. When I woke up, at first I couldn't believe my eyes. I thought it was a nightmare. I got out of bed twice and crawled to the window. I thought I'd kill myself. My wife immediately filed for divorce, and she was pregnant with my child. Only, as it turned out, Sarah got pregnant not by me, but by a rich businessman. So there was no point in my living then. Michael's story shocked Emily to the core. At that moment, she suddenly wanted to scream at the top of her voice at the fact that people around her were just passing by and not even noticing the man whose life was going downhill. I don't know what to say. Emily just stood there, looking into the eyes of this kind, slightly sad man. When I crawled to the window for the third time, the head of the ward couldn't stand it and called a priest, Father John, to see me. He came, told me what to do, showed me a new path in life. Anyway, I changed my mind about throwing myself out the window. I started working as a dispatcher at an ambulance station. I don't know anything else but my medicine. You can't change that. I'm raising money for new dentures. My salary's small, but I save every dime, save on clothes. And the guards take me for a vagrant, thinking that I came here for a drink, John explained. At that moment, Emily looked at her new acquaintance with different eyes. Then, on a mental impulse, she suddenly took a fresh loaf from the shelf and added a couple bottles of milk to it. Here you go, please. My name's Emily. I come here a lot, so I guess I'll see you around. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get home. John nodded understandingly, but he still refused the food. It was awkward. All the way back, Emily thought about the vicissitudes of fate that had turned the doctor's life upside down. And at home she was again waiting for a scandal started, of course, by her mother-in-law, who did not like the fact that her daughter-in-law came a little later than usual, causing her a storm of indignation. Oh, look, if I find out you're hanging around with men, I'll call Jason and tell him all about it. Where have you been for so long? You were here earlier yesterday. But what about today? What changed? Or are you looking for a lover? While my Jason's making money, he's making sure you have everything you need. Emily's cheeks flushed with shame. Her mother-in-law's remark had struck at the heart of the matter. How could she reproach her for coming home half an hour later than yesterday? Barbara, you must have misunderstood me, I explained. I'm going to have a full day of work today, Emily began with difficulty pulling herself together. But it had no effect. The mother-in-law again began to argue that her daughter-in-law did not love her son and only waited for the opportunity to go to the left. Thus the evening altercation led to the fact that Emily, as well as yesterday, closed herself in her room, trying to ignore the angry remarks of her mother-in-law. She picked up her smartphone, brushed away a tear, and tried to dial Jason's number. But as usual, he was silent. The indifferent voice of the cellular network operator informed her that the subscriber was out of range. There goes the phone off again. What kind of conversations can there be at this hour? Emily thought sadly and put the smartphone away on the nightstand. The mood had soured again. Deciding to go to bed early, she had a hasty snack and went to the bathroom. Barbara was already sitting at the TV, commenting on another soap opera. The night passed relatively quietly, except for a dream inspired by the former doctor's stories. For some inexplicable reason, she dreamed of mountains and dangerous climbing to the very top, where every brave man was waiting for respect and honor. In the morning, tired of the intrusive visions, Emily got up, and to pass the time, began to draw another sketch of the future work, deciding not to wait for her mother-in-law to rise. Emily left the house an hour early to get a cup of coffee on her way to work and headed to Sarah's house. What was her surprise when outside the store she spotted John again, eagerly riding his stroller back and forth like a teenager on his first date. When he saw Emily, he was excited. He moved closer, and a second later a long-stemmed rose appeared in his hand, as if by magic. Its soft pink petals fluttered in the wind, making Emily freeze in place. The last time she'd been given flowers had been 5 years ago, the day Jason had decided to propose, and had splurged on 3 white roses, which Barbara had remembered long afterward, when she talked about spending too much on floral brooms. "Thank you, John. It's a pleasure," Emily said with a smile, accepting the flower from him. "You're welcome. I thought I'd thank you for your help yesterday. I mean, if it wasn't for you, that security guard would have thrown me down the steps. Or the police, for that matter," John explained. Emily's mood lifted, the birds sang, and she wanted to float in the clouds like a fairy. And all thanks to the one flower that had chosen to show its appreciation. Ben walked her to the bus stop and waved goodbye, promising to meet her after work. At the same time, Emily caught herself thinking that a man with disabilities took better care of her than her husband, a businessman who had no time due to his constant business with business projects. To the young artist's surprise, the door was opened today by Johnny. "Where's Mom? Careful?" Emily inquired. The boy shrugged, then mumbled something unintelligible about his mom not feeling well after last night's trip to the restaurant. Emily frowned. Honestly, she would have given a lot not to hear the boy's words and not get into the details of Sarah's personal life. Only now did she realize how right Johnny's former nanny had been when she'd said the mother didn't care about her son at all. "Would you like me to tell you a story while Mommy sleeps?" Emily suggested, furtively looking around. The boy smiled, "Sure. And anyway, she's not my mom, she's my stepmom. Dad said Mom died when I wasn't even a year old, and then he brought Sarah in afterward." Emily went pale. "So that's your stepmother. I thought you and her were related." Johnny waved his hand. "No, that's probably why she doesn't like me. My dad died in an accident. Something happened to his tire while he was driving full throttle. Sarah's been taking care of me ever since. I don't like it, but what can you do? That's why I have to do weird stuff to get attention. Maybe someone will help me and take me to an orphanage away from Aunt Sarah." The little one's confession caused a storm of emotion in her soul. After all, how could she have known that Sarah would turn out not to be Johnny's own? But the worst thing was not even that, but the fact that according to the boy, Sarah took full advantage of his late father's money and acted as if she were a rich heiress, not the guardian of an orphan boy. As she told Johnny another tale, Emily thought about how she could help him get rid of his stepmother's oppression. But Emily didn't have time to finish the story because the smartphone in her purse began to alert her to incoming calls. Since Johnny was closer, he didn't hesitate to hand Emily the smartphone. As he looked at the caller's picture, what the boy saw made him uncomfortable, and he instinctively recoiled, still not understanding his reaction. Emily picked up the phone and saw Jason's face on the screen. Her husband was calling her from business trip via video link. "What are you doing?" "Another fiddling on the walls, I see," her husband asked in his usual mocking tone. "I've been looking for a new job," Emily said with restraint, trying to ignore the mockery. Jason nodded understandingly, then continued, "I'm in negotiations again, so I'm going to be late. I probably won't be home tonight. At least I'll be gone for a couple more days. The foreign investors let me down. They didn't come to the meeting. Something happened on their flight. I think they canceled it. You'd think that would make me feel better." Emily frowned visibly. Once again, she would have to spend the evening alone with her mother-in-law, muttering to herself, as if she were looking for another victim at nightfall. After talking to her husband some more, she wanted to wish him well and send him a kiss, but then the phone rang. She sighed sadly and put the phone away in her purse. At that moment, she shifted her gaze to Johnny and saw that the boy was looking at her with a tinge of worry on his face. "Is something wrong, Johnny?" she asked cautiously. The boy was visibly embarrassed, as if he didn't know whether he could tell this kind aunt the truth or whether it would be better to keep silent for the time being. But then the desire to do something good was stronger, and Johnny said quietly, "You'll forgive me, of course, but I've already seen that uncle from your telephone. He comes to see my stepmother a lot, and then they go to a restaurant or something." Emily nearly choked with surprise. "Are you sure about that?" "Maybe you're wrong." Johnny shook his head negatively. "No, I'm not wrong. I even know his name. Jason. His stepmother is always waiting for him to come, trying to cook something delicious. And on normal days, she never does that and orders food delivery." Emily's lips quivered, a cold sweat appearing on her forehead. God, what is this? My husband has been lying to me all this time, Jennifer thought, desperately holding back from crying in front of her child. But her world was crumbling like a house of cards. She felt helpless. The world, previously bright, suddenly seemed black and white, dull, lifeless. Everything inside her shrank with pain. Emily remembered how she'd met Jason, how her future husband had looked at her with adoration. She'd been naive, believing, trusting, loving. Now it was all crumbling under the onslaught of doubt and heartache. Taking her cell phone, she left Sarah's house and dialed her husband's number. Work no longer mattered to her. The beeps seemed endless, as if playing on her strained nerves. "Jason, it's me, Emily." "Amy, what did you want?" "I thought we talked about everything," her husband replied. There was a detachment in his voice, as if he were talking to a coworker rather than his beloved wife. "I need to talk to you," Emily replied, barely holding back tears. "I'm busy. I'll call you back later." "No, Jason, I can't wait any longer," Emily retorted. A lump stuck in her throat and she swallowed convulsively, trying to speak evenly. "I know you're cheating on me." A heavy, tense silence hung. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. "Are you out of your mind?" was all Jason could say confusedly. "It doesn't matter," Emily replied. "I can't and don't want to live a lie anymore." "Amy, please don't be silly," the spouse began to justify himself. "It's not at all what you think it is." "No," Emily interrupted him. "I'm filing for divorce." Another pause hung in the receiver, more tense than the previous one. "Emily, stop it," Jason exclaimed. "It's already clear. You've been deceiving me deftly. All this time I've been giving you all of myself. A fine actor. Goodbye." Having said this, Emily passed out. The tears she had held back for so long came in floods. She fell to the lawn, wrapping her arms around her knees. She'd loved Jason, believed in their feelings, imagined them growing old together. Now her world had crumbled. How could she have been so blind? Why hadn't she noticed the signals her unfaithful spouse was giving her? Turning around, she spotted Johnny watching her from the window with his hands pressed to his chest. She smiled and waved goodbye. Emily knew she would be back, not for the money, but for the baby who had fallen under oppression of a greedy stepmother. And Emily did not go home that evening, confining herself to a cheap hotel room. Barbara was raving and literally exuding venom, even through the speaker of her smartphone. But Emily didn't listen to her, thinking only of how to teach Jason and Sarah a lesson for treating her so cruelly. But when she went to her email account, she felt bad. Turns out she had gotten the wrong address, and instead of a customer, she had gone to a completely different client. Emily assumed that the artist had been sent by the foreman who was renovating her house. If only she could have known that fate would send her straight to her husband's mistress. The next morning, having blacklisted her husband and mother-in-law, Emily went to a lawyer specializing in family law and filed for divorce. At the same time, she wrote an appeal to the Board of Guardianship to check Johnny's stepmother and deprive her of all custody rights. But a major surprise awaited Emily up ahead. When the guardianship officer sent a committee to Sarah to investigate, it turned out that Johnny's birth father was Ben Thompson, the same doctor who had lost his legs years before. His unfaithful wife left to the businessman, already being pregnant from the legitimate spouse. Only this fact the woman concealed, although in the birth certificate of Johnny was listed exactly Ben. In fact, the young doctor did not suffer from infertility. There was a mistake at the testing center. Did Ben's wife know that? It remains a mystery. After all, Kate began cheating on her husband a few months before the accident in the mountains. Kate Thompson later died of pneumonia. And Johnny's adoptive father, Daniel, whom the boy considered his own by ignorance, brought stepmother Sarah into the house. The news of his son's discovery sounded like thunder to Ben. The former doctor cried and without further ado hugged Emily, whose appeal to the Board of Guardianship allowed to reveal the secret of birth. "Johnny is my son, Lord. I have a son, my blood," Ben whispered, happy to have a ray of light in his life. Emily smiled, genuinely happy that she had unknowingly helped the father to find his son and the baby to find his father. The divorce had been almost painless for her. Jason could not prove his alleged right in court and lost half of the property acquired in marriage with Emily. His mistress, Sarah, on the other hand, was even more unlucky, especially after the Social Security staff deprived her of custody rights. and with it, and $1,000 stored in the bank accounts of Johnny's late adoptive father. As it turned out, Jason, with the approval of his mistress, also managed to run his hands into the assets of the young heir, thus finding for himself a real gold mine. But everything comes to an end. Having found a son, Ben first time literally flew on wings of happiness. When he took his first step on his new mechanical processes bought by Johnny, he felt an inexplicable surge of strength. Hugging Emily, Ben promised her to return to medicine and become a doctor again, despite everyone. Emily smiled back, and then, to Johnny's cheers, picked up a pencil and drew a new scene from her graphic comic book about life. There she stood again in her wedding dress, along with a tall man limping along, and a boy in whose eyes she could read the joy at the sight of Mommy and Daddy getting married. Bitter. Emily carefully penciled in and kissed Ben. Then she went to pick out her wedding dress. When the neighbor, Aunt Zoe, asked if Mary could sleep alone tonight, I had to be honest and say she couldn't. It was frightening to look at her grandmother's empty bed, and impossible not to. The silence rang around to the point of ringing in my ears. Who invented this omen to stop the clock in the house when a person dies in it? My grandmother loved her old clock, its rustling, its sound. When Grandma brought little Mary here, the clock had been here a long time. Mary cried. The first night, Grandma sat on her bed and quietly comforted her. You see, you and I will make a good life together, like girlfriends. I have chosen the coziest corner for your bed. Doesn't the clock bother you? You hear, it soothes you. Mary quietly nudged the pendulum and cried silently. It couldn't be that Grandma was gone. When she had been told as a 6-year-old that Mommy and Daddy were dead, she hadn't believed it for a very long time. Somewhere they must be somewhere now, and therefore someday they will come. That's why she flatly refused to leave their home. She doesn't even remember why she agreed. I guess her grandmother managed to persuade her in some miraculous way. Grandma had a way of doing that. At first, Mary was still terribly afraid that she would be taken away by some of the strangers who appeared in the house after Mom and Dad disappeared. There wasn't a single evil person among them. They were just all complete strangers. She was afraid to even cry in front of them, let alone answer their questions. When they asked her something, she didn't just keep silent, but turned away just in case. That way they would get away from her faster, stop noticing her. One day some aunt pestered her. She said that tomorrow she had to go to kindergarten. Mary turned away and looked at the front door, pretending not to hear anything. Instead, Mary answered some incomprehensible nonsense from their neighbor Eveline with her purple curly head. I'll tell you honestly, I'm not surprised. This is a very spoiled girl. Her upbringing has not been seriously handled by anyone. And just at that moment the front door Mary was looking at opened, and a short, thin woman in blue jeans and white, blue flowered sneakers quietly entered, who heard everything, because she immediately answered something incomprehensible too, even though no one had time to ask her. Come on, are you such a close family friend to judge this, and even more confidently express your opinion out loud? And who are you? Violet Eveline took offense. I'm Mary's grandmother, her daddy's mom. I haven't seen you around here. Grandma. Mary shouted and rushed toward the stranger before she could think of anything, just to escape Eveline. Well, hello, honey, she heard a voice above her and warm hands stroking her hair. Right. It's her daddy's mom. She had the same kind and light hands. Daddy had said so often that Mary had the kindest and most beautiful grandmother that Mary couldn't wait to see her. She had long ago been promised to be taken far away to another town to visit her grandmother. And now Grandma had come herself and turned out to be just that. Papa had never lied. After getting to know her grandmother, Mary immediately stopped being afraid of all the terrible fears. It turned out that she and her grandmother had no one but each other. Mary was overjoyed when she learned that it would be just the two of them. It's so nice that it's just you and me, Grandma. No strangers. Grandpa would have loved you very much too. You can be sure of that, Grandma smiled. She wasn't very happy that it was just the two of them with Mary. There were many pictures of Grandpa in the house, but all in albums and only one on the wall. On it, a young dark-haired uncle, cheerful and strong, sat in a boat, and on his lap held a little boy, a little older than Mary. The boy was very serious, frowning and gripping the oars tightly. Mary immediately recognized that this boy was her daddy. They had pictures of him as a child at home, too. Grandma said here they were fishing. It had been some very fishy summer, and they had had a terrific vacation. And in the early fall, 2 days after returning from vacation, Grandpa was killed in the line of duty. Little Mary was afraid to ask what that execution was, and her grandmother didn't explain. Further family history, sad but in some ways also beautiful, grandmother revealed to the growing up Mary later. Her dad grew up and went to Dallas to study. To her mom's joy and relief, he had absolutely no desire to follow in his father's footsteps, no attraction to any dangerous service, and simply enrolled as a project engineer. Thoughtful and focused Henry was very suitable for this specialty. Everyone around him thought so too. No one expected any adventures from the guy, but he did. He fell in love with a girl from a wealthy family. And he didn't just fall in love for a while, he really fell in love. Everything about him was like that. Both her mother and stepfather were sure that sooner or later she would marry the son of a family friend with whom her stepfather had a business partnership. The lad was indeed very shallow, educated in London, had returned, and was making a significant contribution to his father's business. He was in his late 30s, financially well off. Why not get married? Mom and stepfather at first quietly, then more and more frankly and firmly began to push student Emma to a profitable, prosperous marriage. At first she joked, perhaps too carefully and for a long time, so that the family had time to realize that her refusal not the whim of a spoiled princess. But the time had come to speak seriously. Emma inhaled a little audibly, exhaled noisily and announced, "The thing is, I have another fiancé." "Who is he?" Tum Nomno asked Mom, secretly hoping that the beautiful daughter went to her and knows how to find the best of the possible. And Mom was disappointed, extremely disappointed. The groom turned out to be a young engineer, yesterday's graduate of the institute, found a job in a simple construction firm. Everything would be all right, but the groom's mother is the widow of some provincial policeman. And so for this almost rustic, shabby boy, his mother raised Emma her own. Emma with clear skin, a black profile and soft green almond-shaped eyes. Love. But I had it too. I loved your daddy when I married him, who got involved in an obscure project and left me and you penniless. If it wasn't for Jimmy, you'd have grown up in the slums. That's how Mom greeted her daughter's news. Jimmy himself, Mama's husband and benefactor, was brief. "You will marry our friend. We have long agreed." Mom was afraid of his weighty statements, but Emma somehow not. She married her Henry, and her parents fulfilled their promise. They cut her out of the family. Especially since they had another girl growing up, little Helga. Their shared daughter with her stepfather was surely more fortunate and promising than this one, who had inherited from her father. Grandmother Mary said, "I am passing on to you as your mother told me. I add nothing of my own. If you want, you can always look up your mother's side of the family. I once thought it was wrong that they weren't told of your birth. But when your parents died, my matchmakers were notified, just knowing about it just in case. And you decide for yourself. There was nothing to decide. No one had come from Mary except Grandma Ann, so she had no relatives anymore. Now Grandma App is gone, so no one at all. All alone in the whole wide world. Anthony was very supportive. You have to move on, not mourn endlessly, so he consoled the girl and convinced her to go to Chicago. What's there to catch? He's a car mechanic, a beginner, but a good one, with excellent references. If Mary rented their apartment with his grandmother, and he added his savings, and then quickly got a job, they could easily rent a small apartment in a residential neighborhood and still have something left over to live on. Remember, I told you about my ideas before, but you were so afraid to leave your grandmother, as if you were glued to her. And now there's nothing keeping you here. There was nothing holding Mary back now. She wouldn't dare go alone to a strange, unfamiliar city. But Chicago was her mom's hometown. Plus, she'd have Anthony around to keep her company. Aunt Zoe shook her head. "Oh, I don't know. Sure, I'll help rent out the apartment. I'll supervise the tenants. But it's so little, barely enough for a room in St. Petersburg. Life prices are different there, everything. You're just out of college, you have no experience. It'll take you a while to find a job. And live on what? At least here you're at home. and I'll always have a bowl of soup for you if you need it. It's just the two of us. Anthony has thought of everything, made some savings, and he'll find a job with his qualifications right away. We'll certainly live no worse than here. He understands that at first it's all up to him. Aunt Zoe waved her hand back and forth. She got up from her chair, walked around the room, silently, and said, "Your business, grandmother's apartment, is yours alone. And in that sense, there is nothing to be afraid of. But I do not like these fashionable marriages without painting. It's old-fashioned. This is for guys as good and convenient. All these will live and see. Something doesn't suit us, we'll run away and share nothing. You can live with a new one every year. And for us girls, what good is that? Not a wife, not a bride. It's just a trial, temporary. And what hope is there for such a husband? Well, if only he had settled in the city, created, as they call it, a base, and then dragged you with him. But no, he decided to stick to his grandmother's apartment, to make his life easier. And maybe it would be good for you here. You have your own place anyway, and we are all our own. And Grandma Ann would probably say the same thing. You know as well as I do at the tactless mention of grandmother, one might have taken offense, but Mary took no offense. Grandma would have understood, she replied with conviction. Of course Grandma Ann would understand. She understood a lot more about relationships than the rest of the grown-up aunts. Mary somehow knew that for sure. The other thing was that if Grandma had been alive, Mary wouldn't have dared to move so far away from her. And now it didn't matter anymore. It was as if the stars had taken to helping Mary and Anthony. Surprisingly, quite quickly found decent tenants for a long time, a young couple with a baby. Mary prepared in advance, disassembled and neatly stacked grandmother's wrinkled things, gave them to Aunt Zoya for storage. She took only her watch with her. It's so bulky. Why do you have to bring it with you? Anthony wondered. I'll hang it in our rented apartment so I can have something of my own. Well, if that's the way you want it, let it be, Anthony agreed generously. In Chicago, too, everything worked out as planned. We quickly found both an apartment for the right price and a job for Anthony. True, the apartment was very cramped and nowhere further from the subway, and the job was on the opposite side of town. But that's not a big deal if you don't pick on the little things. Mary put things on the shelves in the closet and hung the grandmother's clock on the wall. Walked around the store at home, made some soup, and sat down at her laptop. She had to look for a job, too. Of course, she has no experience, but in college she took first places in hairdressing, creative competitions. And she has diplomas, and she agrees to the most modest salary, if only there was an opportunity to gain experience. Coming from work, Anthony several days in a row forced the same picture, a clean apartment, dinner on the stove. A focused Mary sending out her resume to salons. Anthony was staunchly against Mary working. He said that if they were saving money, they had enough, and in case of emergency, she could just raise the rent to her tenants. Summer came, and Anthony's conviction that there was no reason for her to work came in handy. Although it was a cool, windy summer with frequent rain, it was still a beautiful summer. The city no longer seemed unprincipled and gray to Mary when there was thick shade, clean greenery in the parks. One day Mary went to the museum and did not notice how she spent 3 hours there. She told Anthony at home over dinner and suggested, let's go together again this weekend. I didn't have time to see and memorize everything there, and then we'll go somewhere else. Why did we come here if we can't see anything? We're here to make money. We didn't come here to spend. Anthony explained condescendingly. I can see it all later if I want to. Anthony was working hard and saving money for some important plans, which he promised to tell me about later. A neighbor on the floor, Helen, with whom Mary had become friendly, thought Mary was lucky to have Anthony. You know how infantile guys are nowadays. You've got a hard-working guy. Take my Jack, for instance. We already have Bruno for 2 years. For my husband, the main thing is his friends, his company. Friends are the center of the world. They always need to throw themselves in, help at the first call. And it doesn't matter that his wife had other plans. She's not bored with the baby either. A son is always fun. They're all selfish. Most of them are. So you're still an okay option. Although you're pretty, you could do better finding someone to take you around. But I don't think so. So yes, your option is very good. Mary felt uncomfortable after Helene's words about the options, even if she didn't feel comfortable saying that she was missing something. She had a completely different idea of their life in Chicago. It seemed to her that they had been together for 100 years and Anthony had stopped loving her truly like he used to. He comes home from work tired, often irritated over nothing, collapses on the sofa waiting for food, and looks at Mary as something that always was, is, and will be. Like the central heating radiators, for example. It's true that he changes at night, especially before the weekend. Remembers that there are affectionate words. Promises that he will definitely think of something interesting for the vacation. It's probably just fatigue and worry. Will he be able to achieve something in a foreign city, in a megalopolis? Of course, it's hard to get accustomed here. Still, it's a lot of work for two. Everything is getting more expensive so soon, and the landlord is hinting at a pay rise. We'll have to find a job after all. At first, Anthony will grumble, but then he'll realize that it's better this way. And he won't have time to be bored and think of all sorts of silly things. And it will be interesting, because a hairdresser is a man of art, no matter how much his lover giggles at IT. Mary thought, consulted, and decided to try a different job search tactic. Nothing gives nothing to go sending out resumes listing prize-winning children's contests from college when there is no experience at all. Probably at the same time 1,000s of the same girls are sending out 1,000s of resumes. Helen advised her to go through the salons herself, in person. And Mary, barely waiting for Anthony to leave for work, went looking for happiness. There were plenty of salons and establishments under the modest sign hairdressers even in walking distance. 4 salons did not show the slightest interest in her, but in a tiny, modest, semi-basement, under the glamorous name of Orchid Bored Brunette, after a short survey, Mary revived. She complained to her guests that her shiftmate was constantly missing work, causing the salon's operations to be disrupted, and promised to tell the owner of the establishment about her. "I can tell by you that you are different. If I put a question to the owner or me or Helga, he will ask her, because he knows very well who is worth what here. He doesn't pay much, so he doesn't have the nerve to expect a supermaster. Our contingent is also local. The same grandmothers and aunts for years. The demands are not very fancy. I bet you've been training on the same neighbors from home. Yeah, well, nothing unexpected. Leave a phone number. I'll call you when I come over. Introduce myself to our Dennis. My name." I promised to get him ready. Mary liked Kristen, and the reassurance reassured her. But for some reason the air in the semi-basement room seemed somehow musty, sickly sweet, dizzy and nauseous under her throat. She said goodbye politely and hurried outside, where she barely made it to the far corner of the house before vomiting into the grass. It became a little Pandrucci, but suddenly there was an incomprehensible weakness, as if all the strength suddenly somewhere in an instant went away. Mary was even a little frightened and decided not to go home, but first to Helen to tell her the news. She was happy for her, but marveled at her pallor. Helen shook her head thoughtfully. "I don't want to scare you. It's better to just test right away and rule out the assumption. I have a test lying around somewhere in my medicine cabinet." "What kind of test?" "I don't get it, Mary." "Are you 100% sure you can't be pregnant?" "Then I'm jealous." Helen waved her hands. "Do you think we're from the middle of nowhere?" Mary smiled. "Of course we're using protection." "Aha. I believe every word you say," Helen nodded. "When people tell me how handsome Bruno is, I say, what do you want? It's electronically verified. We planned for later, 5 years from now. But he did it his way. Here I found a test, and don't think about all the horrible things beforehand. Maybe there's nothing. Or maybe there is, but everything will be fine." Why hadn't she thought to ask Helen how best to break the news? Hinting is kind of silly. It's got to be direct. Only at the right moment, not on the doorstep, but when Anthony had eaten dinner and was resting a little. Mary waited until nightfall. And when the lights went out, she whispered in a half-whisper, "Anthony, I'm pregnant." "Are you sure?" "The smells in the barber shop made me sick. Helen gave me a test and it showed 2 stripes. "You're not kidding, are you?" Anthony stretched out peacefully. "You know I don't recognize such stupid jokes." "I'm serious. Helen told me that their Bruno showed up the same way, despite the measures. It's not that uncommon. No method can be completely, 100% trusted." Mary didn't know what to say next. She fell silent, and there was silence. Only her grandmother's clock ticked on the wall. Why was Anthony silent too? Is he gathering his thoughts? Now he would hug her, Say, don't be afraid, we'll raise the child. I found the problem. I'll solve it. It must have been half an hour before Mary decided to speak again. Anthony, I'm scared when you don't say anything. I don't want to say it's your fault. So why don't you go to the doctor tomorrow and find out how much it costs to get it out quickly? And I'll give you whatever you need from my savings. She heard some completely alien voice. Mary reached a shivering and frozen hand over her head, fumbled for the switch on the wall sconce, and turned on the light as if she wanted to make sure it was her Anthony. It was him, and he shaded himself from the light with his hand. Well, what else have you decided to do to me? Well, you're not hysterical. Are you going to tell me you want a baby? But that's nonsense. Why do we need one? Especially now. Mary tried to catch his eye, but he warded it off with the palm of his hand and curved his mouth unhappily. Her ability to speak suddenly returned to her. I didn't want anyone, because I didn't think about it. I can't abort. If there's already a child, I'll love it. My grandmother told me that my father was happy when he found out I was coming. Although he and my mom didn't have anything at the time, he just loved her very much. So he loved their baby right away. I mean me. Of course, your dad's the noble knight and I'm the scoundrel. Did you ever think that he hoped to make peace with his rich wife's family by having a child? No, that's life, baby. Mary silently slipped her feet into her flip-flops, went into the kitchen and cried, resting her head on the table. Whether her daddy was counting on it or not, he still couldn't say, "Put that away quickly, Dot." She knows he couldn't. She used to carry a small photograph of him behind the cover of her passport. There Henry and Emma are squatting, holding the handles on both sides of a tiny girl in a crimson jumpsuit. Stop whimpering, she heard a good-natured voice above her. Go to sleep tomorrow. If you are afraid yourself, I'll take you to the doctor. Well, I'm sorry about that. Soon you won't even remember it. I'm not getting rid of the baby. Of course you're in favor of creating poverty. I could have guessed that when you were picking up stray cats with kittens. Only I'm not a stray. Mary interrupted him quietly. Look, let's you sleep, calm down, and in the morning we'll talk intelligently. I'm at work tired as a dog, and here at home Brazilian series. If you want to talk without drama, call me. Mary watched in silence as Anthony raked the shelves without looking and threw his underwear and clothes into a gym bag. Don't worry, he'll play free wolf, cool down and come back. He'll ask for forgiveness. The main thing is to pretend that you are mortally offended and convinced that you'll get along just fine without him, Helen exhorted and admonished Magga. I don't need to pretend I'll get along just fine without him. If not fine, then terrible. I'll still have to get along somehow, Dot grimly assured Mary. Well, what are you getting down about? Helen continued to comfort her, not very confidently. Mary interrupted her. I'm sorry, you're the best. But you don't need any of this. He doesn't need me. I saw it last night. I don't know why I didn't see it before. No, when I was handy, he needed me. Aunt Zoe was right. If I didn't have the money from my grandmother's rent, he wouldn't have brought me here. He would have left alone, promised to come back for me, and disappeared. He's so-and-so is gone now, Dot. Mary could not stand it and burst into tears again, crying and angry with herself for crying, for not being able to linger. It was as if Helen had read her mind. That's right. Don't be shy with me. Cry as much as you need to so we'll calm down faster. I know what I'm talking about. We fools believe we're loved, that they'll take care of us. Sometimes we're lucky not to be wrong, and often we're not, Dot. Anthony did not return. Calming down, if you could call her quiet, confused state that, Mary considered and realized there were no things left in the apartment for him to come back for. All the little things they had managed to buy in the household mattered only to Mary herself. Anthony had taken his clothes. Was he so afraid of a child that he was willing to sacrifice his comfort to live with a single friend? Mary endured a week and finally dialed his number. The subscriber's phone is switched off or out of range. Dot. Maybe we should go see him at work after all, Helen reasoned aloud, to whom the confusion had passed. Do you want me to ask Jack? He won't say no. He's such a chatterbox. It's not hard for him to talk man to man. Find out at least how your Anthony is in tune. Magus raised her eyes to her. She'd lost weight, her face was drained, and her anxious green-brown eyes seemed huge on him. Maybe he's not sure yet. Do you know how cowardly they really are? Yeah, Mary smiled, strained. I'm all out of money. I've gotten into an untouchable transfer from my grandmother's apartment, which I'm using to pay for this place. If I gobble up that money, I won't have anything to pay the landlord here very soon. Next month already. And Anthony knows how the money is, and he doesn't care. What have you and the baby decided? Helen asked cautiously. I don't know what to decide. I'd feed myself, no question, but the baby, how? What are we going to live on when he's born and I can't work yet? I have no one. I don't even have anyone to come to ask to babysit while I work, and I can't get rid of him. Don't look at me like that, I can't, that's all. I think it would be even worse then than it is now. Helen walked around the kitchen, looked in the spice jars for some reason and said, if your creep doesn't show up, you can always go home. At least there's all those aunts there who were friends with your grandmother there to help you out. But it's a last resort to go back without a dime. You've got a very short time. You could get a job here in Chicago. Ideally an official one, of course, with maternity leave and everything. Employers don't like that. When it's all clear, they say you got the job on purpose. But they have their own truth, you have your own. You need to live, and they don't care. But with your profession and no experience, it may not work out that way. So you've got to have something to fall back on. I'll always buy you a meal and feed you. If you don't spend your paycheck, save up some money here and go back to your town with a little money for the first time. Or maybe you'll be lucky enough to find something decent. Then you can stay in Chicago any way you want. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I'd do if I were you. Work first, and then we'll see. Mary thought she would too. As soon as she did, her cell phone rang half an hour later. It was Kristen from the Orchid. Mary, hi. Look, I won't tell you over the phone, but I think I have something for you. Our dentist wants to take a look at you. He said he'd be at the dealership by 3 this afternoon, so come on over. You want your papers? I doubt he'll be looking at your papers right away. Well, take your passport just in case. I have no idea what he'll think of our unpredictable. It's a good thing she's not nauseous today, and she looks pretty good. She'd washed her hair, carefully painted her eyes, put on the newest of her weekday dresses, and even slipped into heeled sandals, though she usually ran in more comfortable shoes. By 3 o'clock, she was at the salon. The director had to wait another half hour. Mary was having coffee with Rita and a customer from the next doorway, a bright, fresh, red-haired, cheerful lady. The bosses aren't late, the bosses are late, girls, the lady announced, wiggling funny. She entertained Mary and Kristen with funny life stories, and the wait was neither anxious nor boring. But when the principal did arrive, the hilarious client quickly said goodbye and left. Kristen, instead of mouthing off, you might want to clean this place up for once. Not a quick sweep, but a decent one. I can't believe you don't have time. I can see from your receipts that you have time. This, he said from the doorstep, without anger, with lazy irritation instead of greeting. The director turned out to be a dense, stocky middle-aged man in a bright Hawaiian shirt that was tight on his stomach. Have a cheerful outlook on life, Dennis. Something wrong. Just yesterday I was, smart girl, Kristen sang out. Is this the girl you were telling me about? Dennis changed the subject. Yes, this is Mary, a certified hairdresser with credentials, certificates. Let's give it a try. This girl really needs a job. She's just dying to work. She won't ask for time off. Isn't that right, Mary? Yes, Mary said, trying to be convincing. With a friendly glance at Mary, Dennis chuckled. But the thing is, I don't need another hairdresser. I'd try to get an experienced one, if she's any better than Oli. I won't mess with you, so why did you ask me to come? Mary asked, confused. Kristen gave you a lot of praise. I just wanted to see if you'd like to come. I have a restaurant in addition to this place. Now I need another waitress. Cute and smart, the girl accepted the offer, because even seasonal work is a waitress, but not in the specialty, better than nothing. And so before Mary knew it, she was already working in the Café Violet for the 4th week. Yes, Dennis and his companion Pablo had such a taste for names. The institution was located in the same semi-basement room as the Orchid, but the area was larger. There was 1 cook and an assistant and 2 waitresses per shift. One of the girls had recently graduated and decided to change the job she had held onto while she was a student. Mary was hired in her place. The restaurant was quite cozy, frequented, inexpensive, and the place was quite busy. And the food was good. And one more plus at work they fed, of course not the same as the clients, but cheaper and simpler pasta or potatoes with meat, sticky wiener, or chicken leg. At first Mary was very happy she wouldn't have to spend money on food on weekdays, saving money again. But more and more often there were days when every trip to the kitchen for an order became a feat for her. The mere smell of food made her sick. Mary worked in shifts 2 days and 2 days from 11 to 23. And you could never guess in the morning how the shift would go. You would fly from morning till evening and chew cabbage, carrots, and apples all day, or barely crawl, holding onto the wall and trying not to look at the food, coming to the kitchen for an order. The doctor at the women's clinic, where Mary was registered under temporary registration, explained that she has toxicosis, and so often happens. In general, it's nothing terrible, soon it should pass. I wish it would pass soon. Moshet nenormal inyi kukoitu. Nedoverchivo pervala ego Helen. When Ben's cook changes, Mary is calmer. He doesn't notice anything. He doesn't understand it. Like all guys, he thinks it's not much. The girl didn't sleep well. And the cook Kristen looks suspiciously, as if she had guessed everything long ago. Mary tried not to think about it, remembering Helen's admonition. You need to take care of your nerves now, or you'll have a lot of trouble later with a nervous child. It's just a job. You've done it, and you're off. You don't care what anyone thinks. Helen herself knew how to do that. She recently came back to work from maternity leave, returned to her accounting department, and told about the naggingly picky chief accountant with laughter, without resentment and worry. Maybe it was a good thing that heat was a rarity in Chicago. It felt heavy with the humidity here. Or was it just Mary who thought so now? But one day on the shift, it got unbearable. Nothing. It would soon be over. She ran into the locker room, behind which was the bathroom, pulled the door open, undid the top 2 buttons of her white work blouse so it wouldn't get dirty. When she was about to get up and go into the hall, she heard behind her back, "Don't make any sudden movements, girl. There are only 2 tables. The waitress will manage without you. Let's make peppermint tea. It helps. I've got a lot of mint growing in my cottage. I'll give it to you at home if you want it. Ginger tea helps with that too, and you should eat more often and sleep more. I've had 2, I know." Kristen looked at Mary without mockery, but without pity, with calm understanding and sympathy. For some reason Mary felt not scared, but much relieved that she did know. In 10 minutes in the kitchen, while drinking mint tea, she told the cook her whole story. "Svet, are you going to take the groceries?" Pavel inquired behind her back. Mary even forgot that she felt sick, and realized with sober horror that Paul could hear their conversation. This companion, Dennis, young, thin, and silent, frightened her very much. For some reason unpleasant, always comes unheard, such as his gait. With cooks still sometimes greets, even something else will say. The waitresses in general are like furniture to him. They never even dignify him with a word. Mary jumped up at his discovery and happily clung to the elbow of her colleague who appeared in the kitchen. Oops, in the evening Dennis arrived in yet another Hawaiian shirt, and with a particularly heavy odor of booze for Mary. He regarded the girl squeamishly and tiredly and held out an envelope. "Payment is yours for the month. Check it out, it's honest. You don't work anymore. Why?" Mary asked with barely moving lips. How insolent modern girls are, especially those from the periphery like you. What makes you think you have the right to lie and set someone up if you had the foolishness to get pregnant? Something will happen to you at work, and you will go to some labor inspectorate and tell how the bastard director did not register you for work, exploited you, and you will be tired of demanding maternity money. I will not scold you and scare you, so that you do not immediately faint me. I'm just asking you to be quiet for now, and not try to pull something like that. He was almost friendly, without any anger. A smooth, lazy voice. Mary had a lot of things she wanted to say, but kept quiet. She wanted to toss him his money, but silently took the envelope. It would come in handy. It wasn't even for her. The next day Mary slept most of the day. She woke up twice, drank strong tea in the kitchen, and went back to bed. Nothing wanted to do, nothing to think about. It was as if a dark curtain had fallen over her eyes. And in the evening Helen rang the doorbell. "Come to our place. Jack is calling you himself. He wants to tell you something." "He didn't send it through me," Helen announced. Jack was sitting in the kitchen, finishing his soup from a deep basin-like bowl. "Mary, I found out something for you. Maybe it'll be good for you." A buddy of mine, Andrew, is a decorator. He recently renovated a private house in the suburbs for a grandfather. The grandfather's house is fine, but he lives alone. He penetrated. He sees that he's a normal, honest kid, and shared that he would rent one room to a woman for the usual household help, and that she was to him as a companion, so even for free. There are all sorts of errands and talk. That's the deal. A favor for a favor. His living conditions are very good. He's not picky about cleaning, cooking. That's what he told me. Andrew says exactly a normal, proper grandfather. Just alone and with money. He says he can always get it through an agency, but he doesn't trust them very much. That's why he asks all his good friends for a recommendation. I thought of you right away. Lying again? Mary asked tiredly. Suddenly a good man, he expects a quiet old age. And I'm here at him bang and suddenly have a baby. And if I find a job again, how will I have time to do his errands? Then you'll have to pay for the room like you're supposed to. Let's Andrew tell him honestly that this is your situation. That's probably the right thing to do. Let him decide for himself. Mary nodded. Even Jack wanted to help her. She'd thought he hated her for being around a lot. That didn't make sense. I don't think it's going to work out, but you have to say thank you and pretend you're hopeful. So she did. Jack went to his Andrew. Helen exhaled noisily and suggested, let's have some cherry pie for the night. If you really want it, you can have it once. Go and have a look, you've got nothing to lose. Just take a good look at the landlord. Cunning, of course, the old man, instead of hiring a housekeeper for a salary, is looking for a lodger who will perform the same duties for a room. Don't be shy, just ask directly what exactly you'll have to do. Maybe there's a lot of work involved and it's easier to rent a room for money than do it all every day. To be honest, I couldn't do it. There are 1,000,000 reasons to pick on you, but you still have to see it. On his first day off, Jack took Mary to meet his grandfather, who was renting out a room. According to him, the grandfather was not at all confused by Mary's story. He didn't even ask anything. Helen planned to contact her husband and her friend, thinking of a good excuse to take a walk with the child in the countryside. But Bruno was sick and cranky, and they didn't have time for a walk. Mary imagined for some reason a big wooden house in a clearing like merchants' estates from movies about old life. But the house turned out to be brick, also faced with stone without any flash, but very stylish and beautiful. It was surrounded by a small garden, a few apple and cherry trees without a trace of beds and flower beds. This and through the fence could be seen at once. The fence was not a blank brick wall, but a cunning metal one. The graceful gate was ajar, but Jack was too shy to enter and called on his cell phone. I've got a girl Mary here to see a room. Oh, well, let's go inside, Mary dot as they walked down the stone-paved path. They approached the house. The front door opened, and on the threshold appeared the owner himself, holding a large and very shaggy white dog by the collar. From beneath his bangs he scrutinized Magoo and Jack. To realize that the owner was already well over 70, one had to look carefully at his face. Covered with a grid of wrinkles, were deep and sharp, were thinner and smaller. His gaze was quick and sharp, not senile. But its rays softened the wrinkle of his eyes. Not evil, Mary exhaled quietly. And if you didn't look at the face, there's no way you'd think the man was an old man by now. His posture was that of a middle-aged man. With a gaunt figure, there was no hint of decrepitude. Perfectly gray silver hair was cut very short, and a neat beard. In the same way, Gregory invited them into the house. So respectable on the outside, the house was cozy, but a little unusual on the inside. Of course, it was obvious from the many signs that a woman's hand had not been here for a long time, though the owner obviously kept the house in order. But the main thing was that it was as if several different times had gathered in the house. So different was the furniture, even the bedspreads and curtains. In the spacious hallway on the first floor of the XXI century, and in the living room, as if the 19th. It was clear even to Mary that the furniture was antique. She realized it must be rude to stare at everything so intently. Jack, at his host's suggestion, sat down on the edge of the guest sofa and kept modestly quiet. "Do you want to see your room at once, Mary?" asked Gregory. "Have you already decided that I'm the right tenant for you?" Mary was surprised and confused. "Have you already decided that I'm not suitable for you?" Laughed the owner. "Don't be so quick to judge. Let's see the room. It's right here on the first floor. I myself dine on the second floor. There's a study and a bedroom. The rest of the space is abandoned. It's just an old archive that's piled up. I've been sorting through it, but it's a little light. If you'd like to keep me company, I'd be sincerely grateful. Of course, if you're interested. Come in, Mary. A square room overlooking a window into a cozy corner of the garden. It seemed very warm and cozy, though of the furniture there was only an old, empty chest of drawers, a small table with a mirror, and a bed. We'll find a closet for the outfits, assured the landlord. The curtains, if you don't like them, change them. The main thing is not to tear down the load-bearing walls, and the rest is all negotiable, solvable. I like the room. You just tell me about all your conditions at once in detail. You said you're renting out the place for household help, and I want to know what will be my duties. I'm conscientious. But you know I have some difficulties. What a businesslike girl you are, smiled the owner. Your difficulties, as you put it, do not interfere with me. It may sound strange what I'm going to tell you, but try to understand. I know you have no one. I don't have anyone either. I could hire myself a housekeeper pro and have hired more, but I don't want an uncomfortable stranger professional servant person in the house. I don't have a need for the house to be perfectly cleaned, like for a magazine. And I need to be serviced like a luxury hotel. I need a live person in the house. I like you a lot. I don't like all people. No bigotry in the house. It's all the same. What would you do if I were your dad or grandfather living under the same roof as you? A little bit at a time, depending on your mood. Lest you doubt it, this isn't charity. This kind of work is worth about the price of a house. If you can help with the archives, that would be the most wonderful thing. I'll pay you like a secretary for that. Mary had a very different idea of what it would be like to talk to the landlord. It seemed suspicious that everything was going so well. Well, she'll probably find out the pitfalls later. When can we move in? If your friend Constantine will agree to drive back and forth for your things, then even today go. I'll give you money to stop by. Buy us something for dinner to celebrate the housewarming. Yes, I'll cook dinner, Mary promised. Let's go ask Jack. It turns out that the archive is not dusty and boring, does not make you sleepy. Documents a very interesting thing, as if reading a script. Only it was all real, especially the diaries. They're like living, like magical books, when there were no computers and not everyone had a typewriter, and only at work people just wrote down their thoughts with a pen on paper, and life itself was no easier than it is now. As Gregory said, no, there are a lot of good things now, but it would be better if the old good things stayed. It was very interesting with him in general. Helen was worried that Mary was bored with her old grandfather and asked her to come and visit them more often on weekends. Mary was happy to come and walked around town with her a couple times. And then she was just as happy to come back. "Oh, okay, my bunnies, I have to go home," she said last Saturday and was surprised herself. She already thought of this house and the little room in it as her real home, the one she had lived in long ago, and it was as if Granny's clock had always hung on the wall opposite her bed where Gregory had hung it. Not picking on you, Grandpa? Well, about the variety of the menu, or that you put things in the wrong place when cleaning, that you're not neat enough or lazy. What kind of complaints can a grandfather have? Probably like my Jack, only twice as much because of age. To be honest, it's hard for me to imagine Gregory as a picky old man. Mary laughed. As it happens, I don't do anything heavy at all. Just basic stuff, the same stuff I did when I lived with my grandmother. Dinner, simple cleaning. And Gregory takes away my cleaning supplies. If he thinks I should be tired by now, he always spoils me with goodies. He says he bought it for himself, but he barely touches it. Helen, he's an atypical grandfather. There was such a story. There lived a regular old, honored professor, invented various innovations for the Soviet industry and for the military. And he had two favorite students, both of whom had been working with him for many years. And shortly before the 90s, he started some serious project and was very hopeful of advancing it. One of his students worked with him on the technical part of the project, and the other one, who was more persuasive and dodgy, ran through all kinds of authorities to get funding, or some permits. For me, these technical scientific works just a dark forest. I only realized one thing about them: they are very long, and the result is not always as you expect. And so while these companions were working, The funding ran out and the country was in crisis. Soon there will be nothing to eat. It is unclear who will pay for the work, in general, even if you take everything valuable from home to the pawn shop. And when everything was ready, one of the apprentice companions disappeared. The one with the punching bag, Helen guessed, took all the developments with him and took off. That's what it was all about. Yeah, that's what it was. He left, patented an invention there, in another country, and provided for himself and his children for the rest of his life. And the professor almost had a stroke. He was ill for a long time, barely survived, and when he got back on his feet, his wife also took him to France, persuaded him. She had a close relative living there and married very well. The other student stayed here in Chicago. At first he thought he'd get drunk, but then somehow it all worked out. Talent. It finds a loophole. He met the right businessman, but a very smart one. He began to work for this man, a whole production to him, thought out and earned good money back in the 90s, and then also received an inheritance from France. It turns out that his favorite friend, a professor, still managed to work there, but for himself. And the professor had no children. He wrote such a will, half of the property to his wife, half to his student and colleague Gregory, where I live. On this old archive, which we're going through now, is the professor's. Gregory carried it around with him everywhere, since he was left his surname as well. The antique furniture was left to him. The professor and his wife could have sold it before they left. It's not cheap, but the professor wanted to leave at least something valuable as a memento of himself to his student. He felt he'd let him down with his earnings and recognition. So when Gregory bought the house, he moved everything in, and now he lives surrounded by those memories. He wants to dismantle the archive, like he owes it to his teacher that someone here remembers him. Listen, why is your Gregory? If there are no heirs around such a wealthy grandfather, then there really is no one. There's something wrong with him, if no auntie's taken him in. He doesn't mention that at all. I don't ask. Maybe if he asked me something personal, I'd ask him, but he doesn't ask me either. I think he's embarrassed. He's so well-bred that he doesn't pry into other people's business. Yes, intellectuals are complicated, Helen confirmed with a knowing look, as if she talked to professors every day. Although, maybe, on the contrary, it's easier to live like that, if all these rules are observed. I won't make predictions, so as not to jinx it, but so far you seem to be lucky. You even look better, even though you're digging in dusty archives. Listen, I'm not intellectual, I'll ask you. Have you heard from Anthony? Helen, I'd be the first to tell you. I have no one in Chicago but you, Jack, and Gregory. Gregory rarely forgets anything, and now he's volunteered to help Mary peel apples for Helen. And it turns out he left his glasses in the office, probably on the desk or on the keyboard of his laptop. I'll be right there. Come on, I'll run in myself. I want to run up the stairs. Mary had only been in the office a few times. It was Gregory's diocese, as he put it, and he tidied it himself, leaving it a comfortable mess, not without logic. Occasionally he'd do a little rearrangement, swapping books on the shelves or statuettes from desk to floor and back again. Now on his antique desk next to his laptop, in addition to his glasses, there was a chessboard with Jask chess and a small photograph in a thin wooden frame. Mary hadn't noticed any pictures in the study before, at least not in any visible places. The black and white amateur photo. A little girl with 2 ponytails on top of her head is lying on the sand in the surf, laughing and hugging a large striped inflatable ball. Mary remembers every detail of this photo very well. She has the same one in her backpack, in the same folder with her passport, diploma, and several expensive photos. Gregory, the photo of the girl at sea, where did you get it? Mary asked, forgetting her shyness as soon as she went down to the kitchen and handed the landlord her glasses. I took this photo. I was into photography, replied Gregory, looking anxiously into Mary's face as if listening to her strange mood. That's my daughter, Emma. I carry the same picture with me. It came here with me. That's my mom, Emma. Had he found his daughter in time, there would have been someone to support her when her mother turned her away, because his Emma had chosen an unfavorable husband, and his granddaughter, Mary, would have had someone to support, and his son-in-law. Maybe her only real grandmother would still be alive, if her heart had paid for serious treatment. But history does not bear the subjunctive mood. As his teacher and colleague used to say, now we have to live on and live a long time, because soon there will be another tenant in the house, who who will have to be taken care of for a long time, until he can take care of himself. And it is easy and pleasant to live long, easy and pleasant when you have someone to live for. Helen's voice was tense, and she hadn't called in the evening as usual, but on her lunch hour. "Mary, would you mind if I popped straight over to your place after work today?" "Oh, nothing's wrong. Everything's fine. Just in the mood to see you and chat. There's some little things I need to tell you." "Yeah, come over, of course. Especially since Grandpa's going to a class reunion at the Institute, and he's worried about us being alone for so long. What if we need something in his absence, and he's not here? I'll at least reassure him that we won't miss him." "Oh, great. Considering all the traffic, I'll be at your place by 8 p.m., Helen promised. Mary sent Grandpa off in a wet asphalt-colored suit, tied his tie, approved of his gentlemanly image, and escorted him to the meeting. She waved a long time after the cab. When she returned to the house, she dressed Emma and went out into the garden with her. In the far sunny corner under an apple tree, unnoticeable from the road, they had set up a real nest. There the grandfather had hung a baby cocoon for Emma. It seemed to Mary that her daughter loved to lie there and watch the sun bunnies playing in the apple leaves. She hummed something softly and amusingly in her own language, and then fell asleep and slept soundly. Whatever sounds came from the road, the clever dog, who knew not to bark now, sat nearby and just breathed noisily. There too, at arm's length, stood a small, elegant garden table and 2 armchairs. "She's going to have a beautiful voice," Grandpa laughed in a whisper, raising his index finger to the sky. "And she didn't go to the opera, an operetta for nothing. When the city and nature became somehow especially dreary in October, Grandpa came up with an entertainment for Mary. What kind of theaters did she like? Mary didn't know which ones, or if she liked them at all. "I somehow have not had to be in them yet," she admitted without shyness. "We had nothing in our town but the House of Culture. And here I haven't had time. They used to bring some plays there sometimes, but I was never particularly interested in it.ic. "What would have been interesting?" Grandpa kept up. "I like music," Mary confessed, "not electronic for disco, but beautiful music that is good for thinking or remembering something. And the grandfather took a season ticket to the theater, and he so fascinated Mary that the grandfather enjoyed spending time there, and the baby's movement she felt there for the first time. The ultrasound showed that it was a girl. Mary knew for sure a girl listens to music with her, swooning during opera arias and singing along. "You can say that I'm making it up, but Emma liked Queen of Spades the most," Mary once shared with her grandfather. He looked strangely and kept silent for about 5 minutes, like a deaf mute, as if he was talking to himself but couldn't say it out loud. Only his eyes glittered. Mary only then realized that she had not told him how she had decided to name her girl at once, as she had already called her. Emma was born in February, in a windy blizzard in the night. With balloons and flowers, 3 people greeted them from the maternity hospital: Grandpa and Helen and Jack. Jack drove them home, and it wasn't until the friends left after a small buffet that Grandpa sat down across from Mary and asked, "Maybe you did let Emma's father know she was born after all. What do you think?" "Grandpa, it's been so long since you asked anything about him at all. I thought you never would. You don't want to know anything about him?" "I just saw that you didn't want to talk about him, and now it's that kind of day. Maybe you'll see things differently now." "It's the trouble with people like you that you judge others by your own judgment," Mary objected. "You're right in some ways, but don't forget I'm old. I've learned a few things and gotten over my naivete. Just bring me up to speed, at least briefly, while our girl is asleep." And Mary did. To her surprise, it was not at all hard for her to tell her grandfather about Anthony and how easily he had left her, as if retelling a movie or Dennis. It didn't have the slightest relevance to her anymore. She has a different life with other people in charge. Grandpa agreed with Mary. Everyone who should know about Emma's birth had already been notified. It turned out that Mary only thought the recent past had evaporated completely. She was contacted by Helen. "We had a corporate party, a purely female group of people, and the conversation turned to how hard it is to raise a child alone. I told your story about how you found your grandfather, saying that things are not always so bad. I didn't even say your name, but I told them you were my friend. The girls were surprised, happy for you and your daughter, and cheered up. It would seem that was the end of it. A day later, on Sunday, the doorbell rings. There's your ex on the doorstep, looking anxiously for you. I let him in. Or rather, I was just confused by surprise and forgot that I had to refuse the bore. I said, "What a phenomenon." Then he began to me clearly on the prepared to him script. He understands that I consider him a scoundrel. He fully agrees. He is a scoundrel, but only realized everything, and so on in the same style. Probably watched a couple shows as a guide. I sit, nodding, pretending to be touched by his remorse. He sings to me that he would have apologized to you long ago, if you had not changed your phone number and place of residence. He lost track of you, you see. And he only dared to ask me now. He was so ashamed to show up. I was too lazy to ask him tricky questions. I was so disgusted. He thinks I'm a fool. No, I don't pretend to be a smart woman, but not to that extent. I don't know how to get rid of him. Jack was on a fishing trip with Andrew, which would have been easier. Anthony started begging me, "Give me an address. At least give me a phone number." I told him I had my own life and my own business. I had no time to deal with other people's. We haven't talked for a long time. Since we separated, we were just neighbors. "Maybe Mary's gone home. Why don't you go to your town if you have to?" And he didn't believe me for a second. He started going, "Don't lie to me. I didn't do anything to hurt you." He's angry and about to threaten me, even though it's not good for him. I was lucky there was no bite and Jack got home early. So Jack kicked him out. I talked to him outside and made him promise not to come back. Helen paused for a long sip of frozen coffee, patted the dog's withers, and, without waiting for Mary to comment, continued. "I'm just convinced I was from the beginning, that his appearance had something to do with my chatter. And he heard about you at the corporate party, that you were living well, so he decided to try his luck and get a fat piece. It just seems like a big city. In cases like this, you find out it's small. It turns out someone always sees something, hears something, and passes it on to the wrong person. And I'm an accountant. I have a personnel department nearby. I'm friends with our personnel officer. I told her the situation, asked her to look in the profiles where the husbands of those girls who were sitting with us in the company and listening to my story work. We got in, looked at it for a short time. Only 7 of the girls were married. And my hunch was right. Kate from sales has her husband's place of employment on her profile, just like your Anthony. You said the name, and I remember things like that. Remember when we were laughing? It's too much of a match. Didn't I mention you were my roommate the other day? Mary, I'm sorry, and keep in mind he might show up." "Oh, come on." Mary smiled, trying to be as serene as possible. "You've made such a detective out of nothing, even going into the personnel records. It wasn't your fault. You couldn't have foreseen anything, you just told me in the mood. I've always loved hearing other girls' stories, too. I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. If you don't gossip, don't say nasty things behind your back, and just talk about a person, it's okay. Thank you so much for not being mad at me. I'd understand if you were mad at me. Are you going to do anything about it?" "What do you mean?" "I don't get it, Mary." "Shoving my stuff in my suitcase and running off somewhere. No one came to see me. Even if Anthony somehow finds out where I live, it's not like he's going to come here. Unless you told him it's a threesome. Maybe he's picturing a mansion with columns, an alarm system, a panic button, and a couple of grim bodyguards." "Yeah, I didn't mention that." Helen exhaled with a sigh of relief. "Oh, I even said that you have a gorgeous dog, a sheepdog. By the way, this breed is considered unpredictable and aggressive. By the way, you do have an alarm system, don't you?" Grandpa returned home lively, satisfied with the meeting with old friends. He joked, retold stories of his classmates, sent greetings from them to his granddaughter and great-granddaughter, and announced that he had missed them. Mary would not tell him about the incident with the girl's father. Not right, if only he would take care of her and Emma. He needs to be taken care of too, and there's no one else to do it but her. Of course she was scared at first, but just a little bit and at first. Anthony is not a villain or a criminal mastermind, but an ordinary selfish guy. Nothing to be afraid of at all. She'll think of something if he shows up. A month later, Mary almost forgot about the warning Helen she had no time to think about unpleasant things. Her daughter grew up, already sat in the crib and stroller, tried to sit even in a soft cocoon. When she saw the dog, she was happy and stretched her arms to him, trying to run them into his shaggy fur. Don't worry, Grandpa reassured her confidently. He understands perfectly well that it's a puppy. Helen came almost every weekend with her son, and sometimes with Jack. But Mary also had a sudden urge to go to Chicago. Grandpa was supportive. The baby's over 6 months old now. It's time for you to go out. Go out with Helen, at least just a carefree summer cafe. Moms need to rest too. Why don't you pump your milk and I'll feed just fine without you. I quietly read the literature about children in control, quietly the process of cultivation and upbringing. Grandpa grinned, and Mary went to Helen's house. They did not sit in an outdoor cafe and walked around the zoo, but still had a great time. They talked about coming here with Emma very soon and showing her bigger animals than sheepdogs, which would be interesting. They talked about when Emma gets a little older, Mary is going to open up a little beauty parlor. Grandpa wants to help her start a business she enjoys, and it would just be great if Helen would agree to do the bookkeeping there. They did laps of the zoo 3 times. Bruno didn't want to leave. When we managed to get him out, we bought ice cream and sat on a park bench with him. Mary took a bite of the ice cream with pleasure and heard a half-forgotten familiar voice from the side. She shuddered. It seemed to her that Helen did too. Bruno was running around the flower beds, eating his ice cream on the run. Anthony stepped out of the shade of a tree and stood in front of them. Mary, hello. We have to go. Helen rushed over. We're late. Let's go. I'm listening. The last kindly indifferent words were meant for Anthony. Where's our daughter? He asked, making a worried face. We don't have anything of ours, Mary explained peacefully. I'm sorry if you can. I need you, you and your daughter. It just took me a long time to realize it. I'll do anything for you. If you'll let me try to start over. Helen told you I was looking for you, didn't she? Helen stood aside by the flower bed and listened, not even pulling away from Bruno, who was jumping around her. Mary wrinkled her nose slightly. Very, very theatrical. I have nothing to forgive you. It was the right thing to do. Thank you for your daughter. She's beautiful. What do you mean? Anthony said in a muffled voice, with reproach and admiration at the same time. I don't hold a grudge, Anthony. And I won't be filing for alimony. Don't worry. You'll still have all your savings. Mary, don't do this to me. You couldn't have gotten over it so fast. I know you. It wouldn't have been you. People don't change that fast. And we have a daughter, and you won't even let me look at her. I know you found your grandfather, but that's not the father. I'm not giving up until you give me a chance. Now he will play the macho man who has decided to fight for his love. Mary got up from the bench, slowly walked around Anthony, lightly stroked his shoulder. She made sure he took it as a good sign, and said in the same secure, peaceful, and calm voice, People change and fast too when circumstances force them to. I know you're aware of my financial changes, so you're under no illusions. I'm glad I wasn't married to you by the time I found my grandfather. You can find a much better option with an inheritance, even with a child. One more piece of advice. If you decide to look for me or my daughter, in any way to let me know about myself, you know who, what, and how in the 90s earned, with whom you had to communicate. The acquaintances of my grandfather and now of me are corresponding. My grandfather owes a lot to the reputable Mr. Jacobson. If that name means anything to you, people like that don't take away their protection for no reason. You can always turn to them to get rid of unwanted nuisances like you, Anthony. It's nothing personal. Consider it a sign of forgiveness. Bitch. Anthony exhaled angrily into her ear and staggered back, just in case. He turned around and walked across the lawn toward the zoo. Now he's going to disappear from the horizon, Helen said. Listen, I wasn't expecting you. Have you really changed? I felt that I'm not alone in the world and I've changed. I know. Mary, who's Jacobson? You never told me about him. Is he the guy your grandfather invented the production lines for? I don't even know his name. I just made him up. Passers-by turned around, some irritated, but most smiled. How cheerful, infectious laughter of these young, beautiful girls, and the baby runs around them so happy. Jack came to pick them up, as arranged. Oh, I could hardly get through the traffic, he exhaled. Can you imagine? Some uncle jumped up to Andrew and me while we were fishing and began to claim with a pompous attitude that we had taken his permanent place. That's the first time that's ever happened. And you know me, if he'd asked nicely, we'd have left. And you'd go to Mr. Jacobson, Helen joked. Who the hell is that? No idea. We just made him up. He's supposed to be a powerful friend of my grandfather's. Oh, girls, you're so grown up with children and you're still joking. I'll tell my grandfather that you've invented some dubious acquaintances. The group of people, laughing and smiling, continued walking through the park. Calvin strolled down the street, scrutinizing his surroundings. His experience told him that in life, as in the forest, it was important to be attentive and observant. Here, for example, there under the lamp shines a coin that looks like a small button. You pick it up, and you immediately feel happy. Even though it's a trifle, it's still pleasant. Change to change, and you'll have enough for a loaf of bread, and that's something. Calvin's stomach rumbled indignantly at the thought of food. He lowered his eyes in embarrassment. I hope the passers-by didn't hear that sound, he thought. Actually, Calvin always tried to look decent so he wouldn't be mistaken for a homeless person. He washed his clothes in the river or went to a laundromat where a watchman he knew worked. Benjamin treated Calvin as a friend, did not offend him, could lend him money or share his lunch. Eat, Calvin, eat. I can't eat too much, I've got an ulcer. My wife cooks, but it's very good. So I got more for you, the older man said. Calvin just nodded and ate the food with pleasure. It was so good. What can't be said at the thought of it? The boy thought dreamily and closed his eyes for a moment. At the same instant, he felt a slight nudge in his shoulder, which clearly couldn't have been an accident. Calvin froze and looked at the troublemaker in surprise. Half a metro away from him stood a guy whose clothes made him look like a successful businessman. Can't you see it all? Where are you going? The stranger asked. Calvin was embarrassed, but decided not to respond to the barbs. He realized he shouldn't make enemies out of nothing. Sorry, I got distracted, he mumbled, and was about to walk past when the rich man shoved him rather roughly in the shoulder again. Wait, we need to talk. How are you doing with your free time? He asked. Calvin looked at the businessman in surprise. What could they talk about if they were so different that friendship between them was possible only in a fairy tale world of someone's fantasy? Nevertheless, Calvin was interested in the proposal. He could apparently tell him something special regarding a job, or at least a temporary income. I don't mind as long as it's only for a short time, the boy said. I'm running out of time. Calvin pointed to a quiet, inconspicuous shop under a canopy of trees. My name is Clifford. If anything, Clifford Williams is an acquaintance. Calvin felt uneasy under his scrutinizing gaze. After all, he knew that, despite all the contrivances, he looked like a tramp, or at least a man of low social status. I'm Calvin. Well, what are we going to talk about? Asked, in turn, the homeless man. Clifford thought for a moment and said, Well, I will not go round and round. In general, so mate. I have a very interesting proposition for you. Tonight I have a date with my fiancée at a restaurant. She and I have been on social media for a long time, texting each other. Now it's time for us to meet and see each other in person. You know. Calvin shook his head, perplexed. What's that got to do with me? I need someone to go instead of me. You, for instance. Clifford smiled. And then immediately added, I'll give you some clothes, take you to a bath, a hairdresser. Anyway, you'll have to show up at the place at 7:30 tonight. I think I've made myself pretty clear. Calvin raised an eyebrow in surprise. Well, you are. Well, I can't just go out on a date. Imagine if a stranger from the street went on a date with your fiancée instead of you. Is that normal? Calvin bit his lip painfully. But we only knew her in absentia. We corresponded on an online dating site. Most of the time we even had animals instead of avatars. I mean, no faces, you know. I had a cat, she had a cat. Clifford's story seemed rather odd to Calvin. What site is this major talking about anyway, and what does he want with it? Clifford noticed the doubt in the boy's eyes and immediately continued. Don't worry, there's no crime there. It's just an anonymous dating network where everyone has animals instead of photos, so that, before seeing each other, people can communicate without any visual component. Yeah, there's a lot of things being invented these days. Don't you agree? I owe you a decent salary and everything. You can keep your clothes and shoes. Calvin thought about it. Why don't you want to go on this date yourself? Why this circus with dressing up? Clifford smiled. Because I don't know the appearance of the girl who will come to the restaurant. And what if there is some, excuse my French, hippopotamus there? I don't need that kind of familiarity, you see. But you'll come, you'll make conversation. I'll watch from the sidelines. Calvin frowned. But what's stopping you from just coming to the restaurant and watching her from the sidelines? Why all the spectacle? Clifford grumbled unhappily. Look, mate, do you need money? Because I see you're asking too many questions. If not, I'll find another performer. Clifford looked mockingly at the tramp. Believe me, there are plenty of hunters for such a simple job. Calvin nodded, still not knowing what to do in this situation. Of course, in his position as a hobo, he could have agreed without looking, but something seemed to keep him from making a final decision. All this time, Clifford looked at the tramp with a sneer that hurt his ego. All right, I'll do it, said Calvin, just as long as it's fair and without any nastiness. I know you rich people are fond of all sorts of pranks, so that you can mock a man and make a laughing stock of him. Clifford's face became serious at once. I understand, mate, he said. It'll be all right. You'll just come and sit in a restaurant, have a nice dinner, and talk to a nice girl. Well, maybe not so nice, but it depends. I didn't even see her face. Well, do we have a deal? The major asked and held out his white, slightly puffy palm to Calvin. The tramp responded to the handshake, mentally picturing himself in an expensive suit and sitting in a fancy establishment. Clifford was silent for a moment, then said, If you're ready to start, I'll take you to the city bath now. Then to the hairdressers. They'll do your hair, your size. We're about the same size, I see, so I'll give you my suit and my shoes. They're brand new, I haven't worn them, so my outfit will be just right for you. Oh, and I almost forgot. Calvin's heart began to race, but the major immediately added, The girl may not come alone, so don't be embarrassed, improvise as you go. All right, I'll try, Calvin muttered sullenly. Deep down, he knew he was getting into another adventure, and he didn't know why he was doing it. Is it for the money? I don't think so. Most likely it was because the guy just wanted to feel all this luxury, at least for one evening, that the waiter would bring a dish at his first call. The doorman would open the door obligingly, and the girls sitting in the hall would stare at him. Of course, it was all just fantasy, and Calvin understood that as well as anyone. Even if he put on a rich man's suit, he would still be the same homeless man who wandered the city 24 hours a day, looking for a part-time job and a shipment of recyclables. Meanwhile, Clifford pointed to his car and invited him to sit in the passenger seat. At the sight of the major's spectacular SUV, Calvin bit his lip regretfully. No, it wasn't black envy. Not at all. It was more a sadness that he was living his life so aimlessly, digging through rubbish and socializing with outcasts like himself. Upon arrival at the bathhouse, Clifford had rented a suite for Calvin with all the amenities, massage, jacuzzi, with therapeutic oils and mineral supplements. Such luxury Calvin had never seen before. He bathed mostly in the same river where he washed his clothes, and at night he caught crayfish. To avoid starvation, when the catch was particularly good, he sold them to local resellers. In turn, the homegrown businessmen sold them for a different price. Since Calvin had no fishing equipment, he used his hands to pull the crayfish out of the river, which was dangerous. Once he was even bitten by a snake, which turned out to be a snake and did not carry any poison in its teeth. But after this incident, the sense of danger never left the young tramp. Unfortunately, crayfish fishing did not bring him a steady income, because in winter it was almost impossible to get them, especially in the way that Calvin used. After the bath, Clifford took him to the barber. The girl at the reception desk immediately offered to choose the right hairstyle, and that's where Calvin was really confused. The thing was that he had never been to a barber shop in his life. Most of the time he got his hair cut at one of the social centers where vagrants were given minimal help. There was no range of haircuts there, of course, and he had to content himself with getting a machine cut every time. Clifford grinned, then winked at the master. All right, I'll leave you for a bit. Anyway, you'll figure it out without me. As it turned out a little later, Clifford was not a regular at the saloon, although, sitting behind the wheel of the car, he told Calvin that he visited here almost every week. To the young vagabond, it all seemed an incredible luxury. On the other hand, it remained to be seen how he would have behaved with the kind of financial resources Clifford had. Sitting in the barber's chair, Calvin felt uncomfortable. It seemed to him that there were a whole bunch of needles in the chair, pricking him and not letting him relax. Every minute he felt like the girls were laughing at him or trying to play a joke on him. But that, of course, was not the case. Sneaking a glance at his watch, Calvin noticed that the time was approaching noon, which meant that he would have to show up at the restaurant in a few hours. Stepping out of the saloon, Calvin immediately spotted Clifford's conspicuous SUV. The rich guy was sitting there listening to music. Seeing the visibly transformed vagrant, he smiled and handed him a bag with clothes and shoes. Also inside was an expensive smartphone and a watch. This is my gift to you. At the end of our event, as agreed, you can keep everything. Or sell it. It's up to you, Clifford said. Calvin's eyes flashed with joy. He hadn't even thought of selling. In fact, the lad wanted to prolong this feeling of wealth and self-importance. Thank you very much, he said discreetly. Clifford smiled, and a sly sparkle gleamed in his eyes. Look, mate, it's certainly a good thing. I've turned you into a businessman, but now it's your turn. Help me transform into a tramp so the girl doesn't recognize me. Calvin looked at the rich guy anxiously. Is he joking? What if he laughs now and says it's all a joke? But Clifford spoke quite seriously. Then your hair should be ruined, of course, and all that styling and gel washed off, and also your face, to make it dirty. Well, and your clothes, of course your clothes won't fit. If you have any servants, a janitor or a gardener, take them and pile them in the dust and put them on yourself. Well, then you'll look like a tramp, advised Calvin. Clifford listened attentively, as if it really mattered to him. Calvin, on the other hand, was getting more and more into the role of the rich man. Of course he realized that it wasn't real and didn't mean much. But on the other hand, could this be his chance? At the same time, Calvin still did not understand the motives that moved Clifford. Why would he go to such trouble when he could do so much more easily? As they waited for the evening, the time dragged on for an agonizingly long time. Throughout this period, the young people sat in Clifford's SUV and listened to the radio. The rich guy himself was already dressed in some old clothes and looked like a street hobo. He grinned and added, "Oh, I almost forgot. My fiancée's name is Amanda. She says she'll be wearing a red dress, so you'll recognize her straight away." "Well, how will you recognize her?" "Go to her and don't be afraid of anything. Act as relaxed as possible. A confident woman is attracted to that. Then the restaurant staff won't pick on you. They'll think you're just another rich guy who wandered in for a tasty snack," Clifford continued. "And I'll give you a bank card as payment. When you've chosen your meal, a waiter or waitress will come to you for your order, and you'll hand them your card. They'll take it from there. I've got all the protection I need on it." Calvin shook his head uncertainly. "A bank card? Or maybe cash would be better. Somehow I don't really get along with those cards. To be honest, I've held them in my hand a couple of times in my life, and those were credit cards that people dropped or threw away." Clifford laughed. "Don't worry, the card won't bite you. You'll be fine. The main thing is to act confident. Feel like you're in charge of your life. You came to the restaurant to get good emotions, and all those receptionists, waiters, and doormen should provide it for you, but in exchange for money, of course." As the hand of the clock slowly approached 6, Calvin experienced an incredible inner excitement. Understanding his condition, Clifford nodded discreetly and offered to leave the cozy interior of the SUV. Once outside, Calvin felt completely defenseless and helpless. It suddenly seemed to him that he was not wearing a business suit at all, but some ridiculous outfit which at any moment could make passers-by laugh, making him a laughingstock. Calvin took a couple of steps towards the restaurant. At the same time, he managed to catch the assessing glances of passers-by who looked at him, if not with envy, then at least with respect or hidden inner support. When the guy approached the door of the restaurant, he obviously didn't expect the doorman to immediately open the door for him. Calvin wanted to say thank you, but then changed his mind and limited himself to a modest nod. The doorman looked at him so devotedly that he knew at once that he wanted a tip, and since Calvin didn't have any cash, he decided to leave it for later. The restaurant was very crowded. Live music was playing from the stage. A singer in a blue dress sang in such a heartfelt voice that the young man's heart literally snapped. "Why did I get into all this?" Calvin thought. "If it gets out, I'll be the laughingstock of the world. On the other hand, what am I now? Do I have anything to be proud of?" He looked around the room and realized that the girl in the red dress wasn't even there. "That's a shame. What do we do now?" Calvin thought. Clifford's good, too, by the way. Hadn't bothered to give him any instructions on the matter. The excitement was getting worse. He suddenly felt his cheeks turn red with shame and a sticky sweat appeared on his forehead. What if they find out I'm a tramp? They'll start shouting it out, I thought again. In reality, of course, this did not happen, because the restaurant lived its usual life, in which some people had a beautiful holiday, and others provided them with this very holiday. True, for a fee, according to set rates. As Calvin froze like a statue in the middle of the room, the receptionist in a suit and horn-rimmed glasses immediately approached him. After assessing the guest with an attentive eye, he said, "Good evening, young man. Are you looking for a free table? Then I recommend you sit over there by the window. It's a very good place to look around and see what's what. You must be a traveler." "Am I right?" the receptionist asked. Calvin nodded and grasped the opportunity gladly. He also realized at once that his future strategy would be to pretend to be a visiting rich man who was not familiar with the local peculiarities. "Well, let me show you out and get the waitress. What kind of dishes do you prefer? European cuisine or something from our native classics? Or maybe something spicy, Caucasian for example, or something completely exotic?" the receptionist asked. Calvin shrugged his shoulders and added, "Let's have something from our cuisine, but something that is understandable and native." The receptionist smiled contentedly. At that moment, it seemed to Calvin that he could see right through him, and had long ago figured out the whole show. However, the administrator turned out to be a real professional, and soon on the table in front of the guest were delicious borscht with sour cream, a portion of herring, some salad, and something else from the local dishes. The hungry boy was dizzy from such abundance, but it was not the number of dishes that confused the tramp most of all, but a set of cutlery, the meaning of which was unknown to him. How to use this knife and fork, and in what hand to take them. The question of how to use cutlery was so difficult for him that Calvin regretted choosing those dishes that featured meat and borscht. I wish I'd ordered something simpler. Something I could eat with a spoon, he thought. And here it's nothing but trouble. As he took the spoon in his hands, Calvin felt a shiver of excitement. It seemed to him that he was not holding cutlery, but some clever instrument that he would have to learn to use long and painfully. Calvin glanced round the room again, but the girl in red was still gone. Maybe Clifford's just fooled me and is sitting round the corner laughing, he thought. On the other hand, nothing bad has happened yet. Especially in his pocket was a bank card which could be used to pay for any order, even the most expensive. Soon a rather strange couple appeared in the hall. They looked to be about 50. A woman in a strict dress with a purse in her hands and a man whose head seemed to be completely gray. They called the receptionist over to them and spoke quietly to him about something. For some inexplicable reason, Calvin experienced a severe anxiety attack, especially after he saw the receptionist pointing his hand at him. The guy suddenly felt uneasy. What if he wanted to accuse him of lying and would do it right now in front of the whole audience? Meanwhile, the strange couple approached Calvin and sat down at his table. The man looked at the guy with a heavy, unpleasant look, as if he expected that the one sitting opposite the couple should be the first to start the conversation. Calvin realized that something not quite right had happened, and the whole idea was doomed to failure from the start. "So what, young man? Are you just going to sit there and stare at us?" the stranger asked defiantly. Calvin shook his head incomprehensibly. "I'm sorry, what am I supposed to do? I'm actually here for a date with Amanda." The man and woman looked at each other again with that look that made the guy immediately feel sick and his appetite disappeared as if it never existed. "My name is Mrs. Beatrice, and this is my husband, Mr. Frederick. You've probably decided to mock us, young man, but you won't succeed. Is that why you made this appointment?" she began. "I didn't make it," Calvin wondered, feeling embarrassed at having to lie to these seemingly nice people. Meanwhile, Mrs. Beatrice continued. "Yes, who else would it be? You were the one who made the appointment, and you knew perfectly well that our daughter had died about a month ago." "Died how? What about the date?" Calvin marveled. "What kind of date can there be when our daughter is resting in a cemetery? Why, you scoundrel, mocking our feelings. What, you want to play hard to get? You bastard. You were her secret boyfriend, weren't you?" All the while, the one she'd been buying gifts for stepped into the conversation. "Cars at your first request," Mr. Frederick said sharply, switching to you. At that moment, Calvin realized that he needed to leave the restaurant immediately before the situation turned into a huge scandal. But when he called the waiter to pay with the card issued by Clifford, an unpleasant circumstance came to light. It turned out that the card actually belonged not to the rich man, but to the late Amanda. As luck would have it, the card was immediately identified by Mr. Frederick and Mrs. Beatrice, who immediately grabbed Calvin by the arms and unanimously asked the receptionist to call the police. Calvin tried to break free, but his strength suddenly left him, replaced by a feeling of hopeless longing and sadness. The police responded surprisingly quickly and arrived at the restaurant in 10 minutes. But the most surprising thing awaited Calvin ahead. When his pockets were checked, a passport in the name of Clifford Williams was found in one of them. "But it's not mine," Calvin shouted. Immediately he saw his photograph in it. At that moment the lad realized wistfully that he had run into some clever scam. "So that's what you are, a crook. Well, now you'll have to answer for all your crimes," exclaimed Mr. Frederick angrily. Never before had Calvin been so ashamed. He tried to explain to the policeman that he was not really Clifford Williams, but Calvin Wilson, a tramp from the street. But how could he prove it when his own papers had been replaced with forged ones? Hoping to find Clifford's support, Calvin began to look around and look around. Clifford was already gone. The guests of the restaurant looked with disapproval at the guy who had been caught with the gun card of a girl who had died a month ago. At the police station, Calvin was put in a holding cell to think about his behavior and prepare for a clean confession. But Calvin had nothing to confess, and on the other hand, he couldn't prove that he wasn't Clifford Williams either. There were already a couple of prisoners in the cell, and Calvin's appearance caused noticeable irritation. Of course, they took him for a rich guy who'd been caught with some petty cash and was now waiting for his lawyer and daddy to get him out. "So, brother, tell me what you're in for. I guess you hit something with your car again," one of the prisoners asked. Calvin shook his head confusedly, then looked hopefully at the other cellmate, who looked a little older and was apparently in charge of the pair. "You're looking at me like that. Am I wrong? You're used to throwing money left and right. But all things must come to an end," the man replied and stared at Calvin with a smirk. Meanwhile, Mrs. Beatrice and Mr. Frederick Morris were sitting in the investigator's office, giving a detailed statement regarding their late daughter's discovered bank card. Captain Andrew Brown listened to the visitors in silence, only occasionally asking leading questions that might help him assess the whole situation. "You say Amanda Morris was killed in a car accident a month ago." I've heard. I think the car was found burnt out in a ravine. Isn't that right?" "Yes, that's right, Comrade Captain," Mrs. Beatrice said obligingly and dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Well, that's understandable. But a chap's having a card doesn't prove anything yet. Here are the facts that this detainee was exactly who you're talking about. Do you have photos and a social media account? The policeman asked again. Mr. Frederick turned pale and shifted his gaze to his spouse. You see, it just so happens that we don't have any pictures of her fiancé. Amanda talked about him all the time. So what? Gave her a car, a suit. Then something else. Surely that must be him, Mrs. Beatrice muttered. Andrew Brown hesitated for a moment. Despite its seeming obviousness, the event seemed strange. Some strange bloke invites his dead fiancé's parents to a restaurant to pay in front of their eyes with a bank card stolen from their own daughter. Such things happen only in cheap tabloid novels, but not in life, thought the captain to himself. But of course he did not say it aloud and carefully wrote down the parents' testimony. Having finished the conversation, he gently pointed the spouses to the door and himself decided to visit the detainee, who, of course, on all documents passed as Clifford Williams. But as soon as the captain opened the cell door, a sad sight appeared before his eyes. Calvin was lying on the floor with a broken head and no sign of life. The cellmates, on the other hand, stood a little further back and stared boredly at the ceiling. What happened here? Scoundrels, what have you done to him? Resented the captain. The prisoners merely spread their hands and said that the detainee suddenly fell down and began to beat in convulsions. He must be epileptic, Commander muttered one of the cons. But Andrew Brown had already realized that a lynching had taken place. Calling the escorts, he ordered the prisoners to be taken to different cells and an ambulance to be called immediately. Of course, under certain conditions, the young vagrant would have put up a decent resistance to the two prisoners. But since they acted stealthily and hit the guy from behind, he didn't stand a chance. Fortunately, the ambulance crew arrived 5 minutes later, and a young paramedic with a suitcase was already rushing towards the detention cell. When he saw the boy lying on the floor, the paramedic suddenly gasped and clutched his head. Calvin Wilson. Oh, I'd heard he'd gone down and started vagabonding and living on the streets, but I never thought he'd got to this extent. Captain Andrew Brown turned pale. What are you saying? Do you know him? Actually, it's Clifford Williams. The ambulance paramedic smiled and began treating the wound on Calvin's head. No, it's not Clifford at all. It's Calvin. He and I played on the same football team in high school. Don't I recognize him? I saw him here the other day. He's a part-timer at the market, carrying fruit and vegetables back and forth. I've always been good to him. We said hello, had a chat. I gave him some money. His parents died. His aunt and her flatmate took the flat, so he ended up on the street. Andrew looked at the paramedic with regret. Are you sure about this? Can you confirm it for the record? The paramedic nodded agreeably, then added, Sure, what are we talking about? Even in front of the judge himself. There's no threat to his life right now, but I'd recommend he stay in the hospital, since he's probably got a moderate concussion. The captain waved his hand in frustration, then called his escort to him and told him to transfer Kelvin to the regular city hospital immediately. Already at the door, he added, Alert the nursing staff. All right, but keep an eye on them. We'll put a guard on him, of course, just in case. What if he runs out the window? Or somewhere else? He must be a quick guy. Yesterday he was a vagrant, and today he's a businessman with someone else's stolen bank card. In general, the boy lives a busy life. So, with the easy hand of a former classmate, now a doctor, Kelvin found himself in the trauma department of the city hospital. When he came to himself, he did not immediately realize where he was, as he was literally pressed from all sides by blinding whiteness. There were nurses, orderlies bustling around, as well as a doctor who had time to examine him and give his verdict. You have a concussion, young man. A thing not fatal, but unpleasant. So I recommend you rest in bed rest. Also, lest you be tempted, there is a guard outside the door who is assigned to you to make sure you don't run away. It made sense there. Calvin nodded in agreement. Talking was painful, as was looking at the bright lamp above his head, and while he tried desperately to regain consciousness, Captain Andrew was fiddling with his forged passport, made by some folk artisan. You've been set up, kid. And a good one at that. And so it is with this card in particular. I wonder why and who needed it. Was it to put you in jail? But why? The girl was killed in a car accident by accident. Brakes failed. No one was at fault, and she was driving herself. So what's this all about? The policeman thought to himself. There were more and more mysteries and still no answers. Lying with a broken head on the hospital bed, Kelvin mentally berated himself that he had got into this adventure because of his own greed. And I bought it, you fool, on a bogus promise. What am I going to do now? They'll probably put me in jail like a criminal, but I've done nothing wrong. And Clifford's good too. I'm sure he's the one who stole the bank card, but there's no one else. Realizing his powerlessness and hopelessness, Calvin began to grit his teeth. At that moment, an orderly passed by and quietly asked, Look, are you feeling ill? Should I call a doctor? No, there's no need, Calvin replied. What doctor? It's a trifling wound, like they said, concussion. The girl smiled sweetly. And I'm happy for you, I really am. You know, I have my first day on the job today. You could say it's my internship. So I'm very worried about whether I'm doing everything right or maybe something wrong. Calvin smiled back. Well, I don't know about the duties of an orderly, but as a person you're doing everything right. You've even lifted my spirits already. My name is Sharon, she added quietly. And I'm Calvin, the patient whispered. They chatted some more, after which the nurse went to take the laundry to the neighboring block on behalf of the charge nurse. She did not know that the senior had done so deliberately. For exactly 5 minutes ago, she had been strongly advised by Mrs. Beatrice that she should keep an eye on Calvin. And why would I want to do that? No, well, you and I have known each other for a long time, of course, and you can always count on me. But this tramp in disguise, what do you want him for? Very important. All right, I'll keep an eye on him, and I'll write the conversation down on a piece of paper in case of anything. But mind you, don't make a spy out of me. Okay, I'll write it down. I'll pass on the important stuff, but don't count on anything else. I don't want to lose my job either. Annie's older sister cut the call off. She found her old friend's request rather strange. On the other hand, she could not refuse, for Mrs. Beatrice had recently repaid her loan at the bank, which had been an invaluable favor. It was no accident, however, that she had done so, for a long time Annie had been helping the Morris couple with all sorts of medical documentation and certificates. The head nurse did not even think about why the couple could not do it all themselves and ask for her help. This was especially true when it came to taking analyses and all kinds of blood samples. For some inexplicable reason, Beatrice kept asking Annie to fake test results that her blood sugar levels were excessive, when in fact it wasn't. So Mrs. Beatrice never had diabetes. Annie herself was at a loss as to why her friend would go to such trouble. In the end, the head nurse decided that it was all some kind of entrepreneurial trickery that people with money had to resort to in order to get these kinds of tests. Annie contacted the right people at the lab and got it done without a problem. In fact, there was nothing wrong with it, because having diabetes in itself does not make a person exceptional and does not require benefits. Disability is another matter. It is a completely different level of responsibility. Here there is special control, and there can be no mistakes, and ordinary blood tests. The result is more important to the patient than to the nursing staff. That's what Annie thought as she helped Mrs. Beatrice forge the necessary certificates. From time to time, she looked into the room at Calvin, who lay silent and thought about his own thoughts. The boy could hardly know that all this time the head nurse was watching his every movement for some unknown reason. Calvin found himself in the epicenter of events that surrounded him in such a rhythm that he was dizzy. Captain Andrew, on the other hand, did not feel dizzy. On the contrary, he was gripped by excitement, akin to that of a hunter. But now the hunt was not for a beast, but for a man, or rather a group of people suspected of committing a crime. And on top of all this, it suddenly struck the policeman as strange that the Morris couple, Mrs. Beatrice and Mr. Frederick, had not seen their daughter's paeans. Not only that, but they'd just agreed to go out with him practically blind. Why would they do that? Especially since it's been almost a month since their daughter died. That's when Andrew decided to take a closer look at the Morris family, to understand them. To begin with, he studied their biography and found a lot of white spots in it. Morris moved from another city, located a few hundred kilometers from here. They came and immediately started a flurry of activity, organizing a firm selling building materials. At the same time, they already had a young daughter, who was only a year old at the time of the move. That was Amanda, who died a month ago. Although the car crash itself looked a little strange, as the car had been burnt to the ground and it was difficult to identify the deceased from articles of clothing, the Morrises readily accepted the theory of brake failure and accepted it as the main one. Andrew knew from experience that in such cases parents who have lost a child make every effort to eliminate the possibility of error. And here they acted, as if it had been ordained from above. After some thought, Andrew decided to talk to a neighbor of the Morris family who had lived with them side by side for over 20 years. This is where the captain was in for another surprise from the elderly Mrs. Vanessa. Inviting the policeman to her house for tea, she said of the Morrises with a sly squint. Yes, they've always been mean to people, secretive. I've only seen them 10 times in my life. They never go out in the yard. They always stay in the house or in their car. They're true wolves, I'll tell you that. They have a good daughter, though. Amanda as a child often came to me through a hole in the fence and played with me in the yard. They got along very well. But Mr. Frederick and Mrs. Beatrice always scolded her and punished her for it. They wouldn't let her go out in the yard. I don't know what I did to them to make them so afraid of me. But it's not just me they're afraid of. It's all the strangers and visitors they never invite. Andrew shook his head. But that's not the worst thing in life, you know. All people are different. Some are open-minded, open-hearted, and others are reserved, quiet, he said. Mrs. Vanessa suddenly lowered her voice and looked carefully into the policeman's eyes. Different is different. Only with the Morrises, it's not so simple. Do you believe it? Very much afraid of news from other regions, especially when the postman brings a notice or something. Then they don't just tremble with excitement. They're literally paralyzed with fear. The captain thought for a moment. The information told by his neighbor sounded very strange. He himself thought the Morrises were a bit of cranks, but he could not believe that there was anything wrong with them. After talking to the old lady, Andrew returned to the department to make inquiries as to the birthplace of the four businessmen, intending to find out how they'd come to be in their neighborhood. To do this, he called his old friend, with whom he had studied at university when they were good friends. But then fate had scattered them to different cities, and now they could only see each other in video sessions or during summer holidays when their schedules coincided. However, it happened quite rarely because the life of an operative could not be called stable and measured. So, after some thought, Andrew called his friend via video link and waited for a reply. Luckily, John was on the spot and got on the case right away. The Morrises, you say? That's odd. I've never heard that surname, John said. So they left a long time ago. About 20 years ago, Andrew objected. How on earth would you know them? Think about it, then tell me. All right, mate, stay tuned. I'll ask the head of the department. He's an experienced bloke. He'll probably know something. Andrew nodded and waited. John was gone for about 10 minutes. During this time, the captain was bored, but in the end, he got a real shock. The fact was that 20 years ago, the Morris couple had been killed in a gang attack organized by a group of unknown assailants. In addition to them, the housekeeper and the janitor were in the house, who together with the little daughter managed to hide in the basement. The criminals did not find them. Subsequently, the daughter Amanda went to an orphanage, from where she was safely taken a few months later. It was not known by whom. However, no one was particularly interested, because if the orphan girl got a new family, it was more than good. Are you sure they're dead? Andrew asked. He felt he needed a clue now more than ever that would lead him to solving the mystery. John grinned. And, sure, mate. Our department head is the kind that remembers every little detail. In addition, he showed me something in the archive. We've got everything in digital format now. It was a big case back then. A lot of money disappeared from accounts, but no one seemed to be looking for it, because those businessmen were a nuisance to a lot of people. And when they were gone from the city, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Not everyone, of course, but those in the foreground for sure. At that moment, Andrew realized that Mrs. Beatrice and Mr. Frederick Morris were not at all who they claimed to be. They are most likely imposters, having embezzled other people's money and child. Did these Morrises have any special markings? Well, perhaps a mole or a scar, the captain asked hopefully. John hesitated, then said, Well, I don't know about special features, but Mrs. Beatrice Morris had diabetes. She was also on insulin all the time. Anyway, she had some health problems. Andrew thanked John for his help and said he now owed him a favor. As soon as he had a spare moment, he would come for an overnight fishing trip. Andrew then picked up the office phone and called the emergency response team. When he rushed to the Morrises' house with a search, the couple were frantically packing. Where do you think you're going? Andrew asked ironically. To see your daughter. To the deceased in the cemetery for whom you are so solicitous. Mrs. Beatrice's cheeks flushed with anger and unconcealed shame. What do you allow yourself? You and I have not baptized our children. You have no right to poke me. Andrew grinned. I'm not. I'm just saying you're criminals, and you eliminated Amanda's parents. And then you took the little girl out of the orphanage, pretended you were the late Morris couple, moved to another city to start your life over with criminal money. That's it. Or would you like to add anything else? Mr. Frederick turned pale and clenched his hands into fists. How do you know about this? No one knows. How is that even possible? I mean, we all covered our tracks. We had it all covered. The man's lips trembled and sweat beaded on his forehead. It was obvious from the look on his face that he was about to become hysterical. Andrew removed the handcuffs from his belt and snapped them on Mr. Frederick's hands. He might lash out at the police with his fists. What would they do with him then? Half an hour later, the hapless couple were in Captain Andrew's office giving evidence. It was like a nightmare. But after all these years, they were murderers. It seemed so far away now. Olivia and Michael Smith worked for the Morrises at the country house. For about 2 years, the salary suited them just fine. All the more so because they could live in the guest house and eat for free. But the envious couple was not satisfied with this, because all this time they were tormented by a thirst for quick profit. Therefore, when they were approached by competitors of their masters, they gladly agreed to help them eliminate the businessmen, opening the door to criminals. In exchange, they were able to take all the assets of Morris as a reward. This suited the competitors, as the Morrises were so strong that eliminating them was worth even such a large amount of money. Olivia and Michael, on the other hand, took the money with them and decided to live under false identities. They deliberately took little Amanda from the orphanage to create the illusion of a family that not only did not die during the robbery, but also managed to get out of the situation without much loss. It was for this reason that Olivia befriended the head nurse of the ward so that she could use her connections to help fake the tests that supposedly showed she had diabetes. The couple had thought of everything. Except that recently the adopted daughter began to suspect something wrong. The reason for this was a blood test and the disease that Amanda had contracted shortly before her death in a car accident. It was some kind of virus that required blood donations from everyone in our house. And that's when the most interesting thing came to light. The specialists who conducted the analysis told Amanda in complete confidence that her parents were not her relatives. Then the girl lifted the file from the orphanage and learned that she was adopted by strangers. But then what happened? With a squeamish wrinkle, the captain asked. As Mr. Frederick was already becoming hysterical, his wife answered for him. My husband and I damaged the brakes of the car so that it would crash and nobody would know anything. That's how it turned out. The coffin was almost empty because everything was burned. Then some bloke calls up recently and offers to meet me. He says he's a fiancé and everything. So we came and saw my daughter's card. She had an unlimited card with a lot of money on it. So we called the police because of that greed. I thought it was to teach the kid a lesson, but it turned out to be a trap. Everyone wanted to steal Amanda's card. Andrew listened and couldn't believe this was happening to him right here, right now. How could anyone do such a thing? Could these people really go to any lengths to hide the truth about their parentage? And when Amanda suspected something amiss, tried to eliminate her. No, you're not human. You're worse than animals. Inhumans, Andrew hissed and called security. Of course, lying in the hospital, Calvin did not know all this and was lost in speculation as to his hard fate. What's going to happen to him next? Will he go to jail for fraud or will he be forced to pay a fine, which he also doesn't have a penny to pay? And he also thought bitterly of Clifford, who had cheated him so easily. So when the strange guests appeared in his chamber, Calvin's whole body trembled. The first to enter was Captain Andrew with a sweet smile on his lips. Then Clifford, already familiar to Calvin, who had deceived him and set him up on all fronts, appeared in the chamber. But at the sight of the one who came next, Calvin felt uneasy. The unexpected visitor turned out to be a girl of about 25, sitting in a wheelchair. Her face was not familiar to Calvin, and so he waited patiently for the captain to announce his verdict. So, Kelvin, have you learnt your lesson? The policeman asked with a smile. The lad nodded and looked expressively into Clifford's eyes. The latter at once hastened to say, You forgive me, mate. It was all in my head. Actually, I'm not Amanda's boyfriend or even fiancé. I found her wounded about a month ago. Took her to my cabin. I'm a part-time gamekeeper there. I've been helping her out. She asked me not to give her away, so I agreed. Clifford hesitated for a moment, and Captain Andrew looked at him expressively. Go on, tell him the whole story. Don't be tiresome. Clifford nodded obediently to the captain and continued. I had to play the rich man to ask you to go to the restaurant. You're Amanda's fiancé who wants to see her parents, and I didn't want the people who wanted to kill her to find out about my meeting with her in the woodshed. So that's what happened. The same people saw the bank card and called the police. That's how they got suspicious. Although with a fake passport in my jacket pocket, it was a bit too much. I confess and repent for what I've done. Calvin shook his head and immediately cringed at the intolerable headache. But why the need for such complications? Couldn't you have done without it? And why didn't you go to the meeting yourself? At this point, the girl, who was in a wheelchair, allowed herself to participate in the conversation for the first time since the meeting. I was the one who asked Clifford to use someone else, because if Clifford had stayed late, I would have been left all alone in that forest cabin. I was very much afraid that my imposter parents, on learning that I was alive, would try to eliminate me. I'd noticed as a child that I didn't look anything like them. But then my mum dyed her hair, and the difference was no longer so striking. And I lived and still felt like they were strangers. And now it's all coming out. And it's mostly thanks to you. Please forgive us. For my part, I promise to make up for all the damage we've done to you. Calvin exhaled in relief. No, I don't need any reparations. That's fine. Just next time, tell the whole truth all at once, not like this, in pieces. After his words, there was a tense pause in the room. The policeman looked at the young people and quietly went out into the corridor, giving them a chance to talk to each other for a while. As it turned out later, the whole time Amanda had been injured, she had been hiding out in the cabin with Clifford, who had been spying on her parents and trying to find a way to bring them out. He sent anonymous letters to the police several times, but the notes, for some strange reason, did not reach their recipients. Then he and Amanda decided on such a risky combination as bringing in a person from the outside. Clifford wasn't really a businessman. The posh suvvy used to pick Calvin up from the town bath and barbershop had been hired by him. What a combinator, of course. They nearly tore me up in jail there when they found out I was a rich man, but I'm not even a businessman. I'm a vagrant, just hanging around the back alleys, Calvin mused ironically. I think we'll fix that. Once you recover, your situation will change, Amanda said with a smile. Calvin looked at his guest incredulously. How will it change? A tramp is forever. It's like a stigma. You know. No, that's not what I meant to say. When I get through treatment, I'm going to take the parenting business further, or rather, what's left of it. And I could really use reliable people, Amanda replied immediately. Calvin nodded curtly. still not believing that his life could change so dramatically. Soon the guards were removed from his room, and he was able to go out into the corridor like a normal person. He was hardly dizzy anymore, and thanks to Sharon's help, he was feeling much better. Calvin spent hours chatting with the nice nurse about everything in the world, and he didn't even notice how something special, unlike anything he had ever experienced before, was beginning to stir in his soul. Sharon turned out to be a decent worker. Her childhood was spent in a remote village where her mother worked as a milkmaid and her father as a mechanic for a local farmer. During her school years, Sharon felt as if her whole life was planned ahead of her, as her parents knew they would marry her off to Bill, a neighborhood boy. But when Bill was drafted into the army, the first painful crack in Sharon's life appeared. And first of all, it was connected with her fiancé, who during the army service had an affair on the side, corresponded with a girl from another city. Needless to say how painful it was for Sharon when after demobilization Bill married another. The abandoned girl did not want to endure the ridicule of her fellow villagers and the reproach of her parents, and then, having packed her things, ran away to the city. From early childhood, Sharon dreamed of entering the medical school, but unfortunately, at the exam she lacked only a few points to pass on the budget. But she was not offended, because she understood perfectly well that in such a case the knowledge must be impeccable. After all, you are a future doctor, which means that you should know any subject related to medicine on the excellent, she said to herself. Still trying to connect her life with this field, Sharon decided to get a job as a nurse in the trauma center, where a vacancy had just opened up. She rented a room and started living on her own. She loved her job, independent of her parents, and if it weren't for the nagging of the head nurse, she could consider herself happy. Calvin listened to Sharon and smiled. At that moment, it was as if a film was playing in front of his eyes, in which this sweet and kind country girl was playing the main role. After being discharged from the hospital, Calvin did not stop his communication with Sharon, began to meet her after work to take her home. But Amanda, as promised, took him to work. Security guard with the prospect of a promotion to shift supervisor. I guess for a guy off the street, this was the chance he'd dreamed of all his life. Calvin didn't miss it, and a year later he got his long-awaited promotion. Amanda, on the other hand, was treated and now walks like a normal person, only occasionally leaning on a miniature stick. After consulting with Calvin, Clifford proposed to Amanda, which delighted not only his chosen one, but also Sharon, who was actively preparing for the wedding because of her pregnancy. Coincidentally, the two young couples decided to tie themselves in marriage on the same day. But the most surprising was that the holiday was held in a restaurant, which Calvin remembered in the smallest detail. After all, this was the place where his transformation from a tramp to a successful businessman had begun, when he had gone on a blind date at Clifford's request. However, now Calvin had a good understanding of restaurant cuisine and was not afraid that anything could interfere with his family happiness with Sharon. And of course, the guest of honor at the double wedding was Captain Andrew.